Imagine a disease so merciless that a single bite could seal a life, yet invisible enough to haunt the very air of London's fog-choked streets. Welcome back. If you're watching from somewhere quiet tonight, make sure to subscribe and stay with me, because this story will take you into the hidden terrors of Victorian life. The city sleeps under gaslight and mist, unaware that an unseen predator moves among them. Dogs, once companions, become agents of an inexorable fate. Their teeth carry a silent verdict that no doctor, no tonic, no antiseptic could overturn. In parlors fragrant with lavender and opium, whispers of hydrophobia circulate, while families shutter windows and servants tread lightly, fearing even their own shadows. The bite of a rabid beast was not merely an injury, it was a sentence, measured in days of mounting terror, delirium, and inevitable death. In this tale, we will step into the alleys, infirmaries, and homes of Victorian London, where certainty dissolved with the first signs of madness, and the veneer of polite society could not hide the city's quiet panic. Stay with me. What you are about to witness is the horror that Victorian London could not escape, and the deadly truth behind a bite that spelled doom. The fog pressed against London like a damp shroud, curling through narrow alleys and slipping beneath the half-closed shutters of Georgian townhouses. Gas lamps struggled to pierce the murk, their feeble light trembling across slick cobblestones, revealing glimpses of figures hunched against the chill. Among them, a small dog padded silently, its fur matted with the damp of the morning mist. No one took particular notice of it. In a city so densely packed, so endlessly restless, the ordinary movements of animals were rarely remarked upon. And yet, in the quiet observation of a dog, the first pulse of terror began. It belonged to a baker's boy who kept it tethered to a post outside his lodgings. Its eyes, bright and expectant, followed the comings and goings of the street with the innocence of a familiar companion. But the streets of London were no longer safe in innocence alone. This dog, so unassuming, carried within its small body the seeds of an invisible sentence. There was no growl, no twitch of warning, only the ordinary wag of tail, the soft nuzzle against a hand reaching for crumbs. A bite here, a scratch there, and a life could shift irrevocably from the mundane to the macabre. Doctors had not yet understood the full scope of the danger. Families whispered behind lace curtains about mad dogs and hydrophobia, using words that softened reality, yet hinted at the dread their syllables could not fully contain. In parlors scented with lavender and heated by coal fires, mothers pressed children close. Servants moved quietly in and out, careful not to disturb the fragile semblance of calm. Outside, the city's life continued, rickety carts rattling, women in hoop skirts pausing to greet acquaintances, and street vendors shouting their wares into the fog. All the while, an imperceptible threat moved among them, silent, patient, and indiscriminate. The baker's boy, unaware of the danger, scratched the dog behind the ears. A small bite, barely noticeable, broke the surface of his skin. He shrugged it off and returned to his work, flour dusting his hair like frost. That night, the first unease stirred, a mild fever, a restless sleep, and the subtle twitching of a hand. It was nothing, he thought. London had always been a city of minor ailments, of fainting fits, of colds that lingered and then vanished. Yet, beneath the surface, the disease was already claiming dominion. In the quiet of that night, as the wind moaned through the chimneys and the gas lamps flickered with exhaustion, the dog curled at the hearth of its small lodgings. It dreamed perhaps of running through open fields, but in reality, it carried the shadow of inevitability. London would not notice at first. Its fog and noise and bustle would obscure the truth. And yet, the city's heartbeat had shifted, imperceptibly, toward dread. The harmless companion had delivered its verdict. In the days to come, a simple scratch would blossom into something monstrous, and the city, so confident in its doctors and remedies, would soon discover that the bite of a rabid dog was the opening act of a sentence from which there would be no reprieve. Morning arrived over London like a pale promise, the sun barely a suggestion behind the dense haze that clung to the river and the narrow streets. In households large and small, the city stirred with ritualized motions. The sweep of brooms, the clatter of boots on wood floors, and the measured precision of breakfasts prepared with care. In one modest dwelling, the baker's boy attended to his daily chores, still oblivious to the small puncture in his hand, the trace of teeth that had seemed inconsequential only hours before. To him, it was a nuisance, a scratch that would fade with soap and water. London, ever bustling, had no patience for minor accidents. One might forget such trifles, as the city itself seemed to do, moving forward without acknowledgement of the subtle dangers that threaded through it. Doctors would later write of such wounds with clinical detachment, noting them as simple abrasions, unworthy of alarm. Yet beneath the polite veneer of antiseptic assurance, uncertainty festered. A city confident in its order, in its chemists and physicians, found itself unprepared for a peril that neither soothed with laudanum nor succumbed to the mercies of a steady hand. The bite, dismissed, began a slow transformation, imperceptible to the naked eye. Fever whispered, stiffness crept along joints, and a restless agitation burrowed beneath calm expressions. It was a quiet metamorphosis, a patient unfolding of dread that London would not perceive until its consequences could no longer be ignored. Neighbours exchanged pleasantries over shared fences and gateposts, speaking of trifling ailments and minor colds, their voices careful and measured. Children, ignorant of their own vulnerability, played in the streets under the watch of distant guardians. All moved within a fragile equilibrium, a dance of routine that concealed the undercurrent of danger. The dog, now invisible in its menace, prowled the alleys, sniffing and trotting with the innocence of a familiar companion. To those who saw it, nothing seemed amiss. Yet the city teetered on the brink, balanced between ignorance and revelation. By afternoon, the baker's boy began to notice a faint discomfort, a stiffness in the hand that had been scratched, a tingle along the arm that could be dismissed as fatigue. He carried on, flour dusting his coat like powdered snow, while his mother fussed over tea and the scent of burning coal. Conversation turned to the weather, to deliveries, to the minutiae of daily survival. The danger remained quiet, patient, like a shadow pressing closer without acknowledgement. As evening descended, the city's fog thickened, curling into doorways, enveloping lamp posts, and pressing against the panes of windows. The baker's boy washed his hands, inspected the scratch, and convinced himself it was nothing. Politeness and reason, those twin pillars of Victorian composure, demanded dismissal of minor injuries, and so he forgot that the city's quiet companion had already begun its work, shaping a fate that would unspool in the days to come. In the hush of the night, as London slept beneath a gaslit pall, the first whispers of hydrophobia stirred not in the streets, not yet in the parlours, but in the unseen space where certainty faltered. A scratch, a nuisance, a forgetting. The city would soon learn that even the smallest wound could presage a merciless sentence. Evening fell over London with a damp and deliberate heaviness, settling into the alleys and courtyards like a slow, suffocating breath. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly, their wavering light reflected off slick cobblestones, creating shadows that trembled as if alive. In the narrow passage behind a row of brick townhouses, a hushed conversation stirred a whisper, carried from one doorway to another, traveling faster than any official report, yet slower than the invisible menace that prowled unseen. The first hints of fear had begun to take root, quiet as a thought but sharp enough to pierce the veil of everyday certainty. A young maid, her skirts damp from the fog, leaned against a gate and lowered her voice. "Did you hear? Mrs. Grindle's boy, bitten and gone mad within the week." Her companion shivered, not merely from the chill, but from the vivid image her words conjured. A child, delirious, struggling with an inexplicable terror that no parent could soothe, no doctor could halt. The alleys, usually alive with the clatter of boots and the murmur of business, had taken on a new cadence. Caution, vigilance, the quiet observation of what might otherwise be ordinary movements of animals and people alike. In the homes above, families closed shutters and drew curtains, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow even as they were spoken. Children were gathered close, their small hands gripping the folds of skirts or the sleeve of a parent. Servants moved with a careful deliberation, their eyes darting to every shadow, every movement of dogs in the streets, every unfamiliar sound. London itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that an imperceptible force had begun to thread its way through the city's veins. Reports reached the chemists and the physicians by word of mouth first. A fever here, a spasm there, an inability to drink from a cup without convulsion. The men of medicine, so confident in their knowledge of life and death, were forced into a rare humility. Hydrophobia, they noted in their journals with antiseptic precision, was not to be dismissed, yet its arrival was subtle, almost invisible at first, cloaked in symptoms easily mistaken for other maladies. The city's reliance on authority, on the certainty of learned men in white coats, began to falter. And still, the alleys whispered. From narrow side streets to the open squares, cautious murmurs passed between neighbors, dock workers, and street vendors. The invisible predator dogs that had seemed harmless companions had begun its quiet work. No growl, no overt aggression, only the subtle marks left unnoticed, the faintest abrasions that would later bloom into terror. Londoners moved through the fog with polite smiles and forced attention to business, all the while feeling the pressure of a fear that could not be named aloud without inviting panic. By nightfall, the whisper had become a current, circulating through homes, shops, and parlors alike. What had seemed improbable, almost impossible, now pressed against consciousness. A bite, a scratch, a glance from a dog could carry the inexorable weight of death. The city, in all its gaslit confidence, had begun to recognize that the invisible had power beyond human control. And in the alleys, in the shadows between shutters and street lamps, London waited aware, anxious, and utterly unprepared for the sentence it had already received. Days passed in London with a deceptive quiet, the city continuing its routines under a veneer of normalcy. Shopkeepers polished counters, carts rattled over cobblestones, and servants moved between rooms, carrying tea and coal with meticulous precision. Outside, dogs prowled as always, their movements casual, unremarkable. To the eye, nothing had changed. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle unease had taken hold, creeping like a shadow along the edges of consciousness. The comfort of delay, so reassuring to parents, guardians, and the unsuspecting, masked a growing inevitability that no polite household could ignore. The incubation period worked with a patience impossible for human minds to measure. A scratch, a bite minor, almost trivial, was dismissed. Fever did not appear immediately, nor did the twitching that would later alarm onlookers. Londoners were lulled by the apparent safety of routine. Children played under watchful eyes, their laughter echoing through narrow streets, and servants attended to chores with the quiet efficiency that Victorian propriety demanded. In this lull, the city deceived itself. Time, once a measure of certainty, became the accomplice of the disease, allowing its invisible workings to advance unnoticed. In parlors fragrant with lavender and warmed by coal fires, mothers and governesses speculated on trifling complaints, sleepless nights, irritability, mild fever, never imagining that these small signs were the earliest harbingers of hydrophobia. Doctors reassured them with calm voices, prescribing bitters and syrups, offering measured doses of laudanum to ease restlessness. Authorities spoke with the confidence of science, Yet the comfort it offered was fragile. The city relied on ritual, on observation, on careful attention to symptoms that, in truth, arrived only when the disease's grip was already tightening. Outside, the fog pressed against shuttered windows and damp streets, concealing a menace that moved with quiet purpose. Dogs passed through alleys and marketplaces, innocent to the world but carriers of an inexorable sentence. Each minor encounter a pat on the head, a playful scratch became a quiet contract with fate. Londoners, unseeing, unknowing, carried on as if the ordinary could shield them from the extraordinary, unaware that the comfort of delay was itself a form of cruelty, a slow march toward inevitable horror. Evenings were filled with the sounds of routine, the scrape of boots, the creak of gates, the soft murmur of conversation over tea. Yet in the silence between these noises, a tension lingered. Infected bodies, still unaware, rested in beds, hands twitching lightly in dreams that were neither restful nor safe. Families slept beside them, confident in precaution yet ignorant of the invisible work of disease beneath skin and bone. By the week's end, the city's illusion of safety began to fracture. Minor complaints escalated to agitation, mild fever to chills and spasms. Doctors who had offered reassurance now noted subtle signs in their ledgers, the earliest hints of madness creeping into ordinary lives. The comfort of delay, that fragile shield, had allowed the disease to gain ground, and London stood on the brink of a terror that would soon be visible, undeniable, and utterly merciless. In the parlours of Victorian London, words were carefully chosen, measured for propriety, and delivered with the soft cadence of civility. It was in this world of whispered conversation and restrained gestures that the name hydrophobia first circulated, a term that offered the illusion of safety even as it concealed the full measure of terror. To speak of rabies openly was to invite panic, to disrupt the delicate balance of routine and order. Hydrophobia sounded almost clinical, almost manageable, a disease to be recorded in the ledgers of physicians rather than feared in the streets. Yet behind the syllables lay a horror no parlour could contain, no gaslit lamp could dispel. Families first encountered the term when a neighbour, in hushed urgency, recounted a visit to the surgeon. A child bitten by a stray, now restless, feverish, and fearful of water. The mother, herself trembling under the soft light of a gas lamp, repeated the word to herself, hydrophobia. It was almost comforting in its detachment, a label that suggested medical understanding, a precise classification, when in truth it was merely a signpost pointing toward the inevitable. The disease moved silently through the city, each bite, each scratch a quiet sentence written on skin, a verdict that words could never fully articulate. Doctors, trained to command authority, now found themselves ensnared in the limitations of language. Hydrophobia appeared in their journals with antiseptic certainty. The sequence of symptoms, the patient's restlessness, the involuntary spasms, the unmistakable terror of water. These accounts were precise, clinical, and proper, yet they could not mitigate the dread that seeped into households. Parents, governesses, and servants read the descriptions in newspapers and pamphlets, their minds attempting to translate measured terms into understanding, only to confront a terror that refused to be rationalized. Outside, London's streets remained deceptively ordinary. Children skipped along the cobbles, dogs trotted faithfully at their heels, and tradesmen hawked goods from carts with practiced cheer. Yet, the disease threaded through the city like an invisible current, unnoticed until the first signs became undeniable. A scratch that had seemed inconsequential in the morning now bore its consequences in trembling limbs and fevered eyes. Polite conversation gave way to whispered counsel, and servants began to move more cautiously, avoiding contact with animals and observing the smallest changes in those they served. The city's rhythm had not stopped, but the tempo of anxiety had quickened beneath its orderly surface. Hydrophobia, as a word, offered a fragile refuge. a way to speak of the unspeakable with the dignity Victorian propriety demanded. Yet within homes, families felt the weight of its true meaning, a slow, inexorable progression from bite to terror, from fever to delirium, from ordinary life to the merciless certainty of death. The disease did not announce itself with spectacle. It moved quietly, patiently, while the city remained outwardly composed. By the end of the week, whispers of hydrophobia had multiplied, carried from parlour to parlour, alley to alley, subtle and chilling. Londoners, clinging to the safety of words, could not yet comprehend the scope of the menace, nor the inevitability that awaited those touched by the invisible teeth of a dog. The language of civility offered no protection. It was only a mask for the dread that now pressed closer with every passing hour. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet for those who knew where to look, they were the unmistakable harbingers of a cruel fate. A slight stiffness in a finger, a restless tossing in the night, a fever that ebbed and flowed with no discernible cause, all were easily attributed to fatigue, to the damp chill of London fog, or to the overexertion of daily labour. In parlours perfumed with lavender and warmed by coal fires, mothers whispered reassurances that their children were merely unwell, that proper rest and a warm broth would suffice. Doctors, with their calm authority and antiseptic journals, nodded with measured confidence, recording symptoms with clinical detachment, unaware or perhaps unwilling to recognize the subtle escalation toward madness. The city moved on, unaware of the invisible clock counting down the hours until its innocuous bite would claim dominion over flesh and mind. Streets that had bustled with cheerful noise now seemed lined with a quiet apprehension. Servants tread lightly across floors, glancing at children and animals with a newly cautious eye. The baker's boy, who had been scratched days before, continued his work, washing flour from his hands, dismissing a mild fever as inconsequential. Yet, beneath the ordinary motions of daily life, the disease took hold, insidious and patient, working in secret, while London clung to the comforting illusion that normality remained intact. By afternoon, a mild agitation became noticeable. A slight tremor in the hand, a reluctant sip of water, a refusal to drink, were dismissed as whims of childhood or minor indispositions. Families clung to familiarity and routine, unwilling to see what had already begun to unfold. The comfort of social norms, the confidence in medical authority, and the insistence on propriety all conspired to mask the early symptoms. The subtle progression was invisible to the casual observer, yet those who would later witness the full extent of the disease would recognize, with retrospective horror, that the first warning had long been present. Physicians attempted to intervene with remedies both common and arcane, bitters, tonics, poultices, and the occasional soothing draught of laudanum. The application of these measures brought temporary relief to nerves and spirits, yet could not touch the inexorable march of infection coursing through nerves and sinews. The city's confidence in its practitioners remained unshaken, even as children grew restless, as sleep became disturbed, as an unspoken dread began to thread itself through households. Servants, trained to move quietly, began to observe subtle changes in their charges. A child who flinched at the sight of water, a boy or girl whose hand twitched against their side, a subtle irregularity in gait or posture. Evening descended upon London with its familiar fog and gaslight, and the city's inhabitants, oblivious to the gravity of the creeping malady, dined, conversed, and prepared for rest. Yet in the quiet corners of homes, behind curtains, and in the dimly lit nurseries, the early symptoms that had been ignored whispered of inevitability. London's polite composure could not shield it from the coming terror, and the subtle, unnoticed signs of hydrophobia were the first cruel notes in a symphony that would crescendo into delirium, madness, and death. The offices of London's physicians were rooms of calm precision, their walls lined with shelves of glass bottles, neatly labelled, each holding tinctures, powders, and mysterious compounds that promised mastery over the frailties of the human body. Within these antiseptic chambers, men in starched collars and spotless coats maintained a confidence that seemed unshakable, a belief in the power of science to impose order on the chaos of life and illness. It was here, in the face of invisible dread, that many families sought solace, arriving with children pale and restless, their hands bearing the faint scars of a minor bite, their eyes wide with unspoken fear. "Hydrophobia, you say?" the physician murmured, voice calm, measured. He examined the hand with a delicate touch, inspecting the tiny punctures that carried consequences no eye could yet perceive. "It is nothing to cause undue alarm," he assured, writing in his journal with meticulous care. His words, deliberate and precise, carried the authority of knowledge, the certainty of procedure. Families clung to them as one clings to a lifeline tossed in stormy seas, believing that the doctor's calm could transform danger into mere discomfort. Yet beneath his measured reassurance, even the physician's practiced eyes could not fully pierce the invisible threat that had already begun its quiet work within the child's body. In homes, the effect of his words was immediate. Mothers exhaled in relief, servants relaxed their watchfulness, and children, reassured by the tone of authority, felt safe enough to resume their play. The city outside continued, oblivious, with carts rattling across cobblestones, horses pawing at streets slick with morning fog, and vendors hawking goods in familiar rhythm. London's confidence in its medical men was absolute, and yet it was precisely this confidence that allowed the disease to advance, unseen and unchallenged, beneath the veil of ordinary life. The doctor prescribed tonics, small doses of laudanum, and careful observation. He spoke of rest, nourishment, and cleanliness, offering families rituals of care that provided a comforting illusion of control. Yet he could not explain, for no words yet existed to do so, why the child sometimes recoiled from water, why the fingers twitched when no one watched, why the nights were restless and troubled. He could reassure, he could record, he could prescribe, but he could not stop what had been set in motion by the quiet teeth of a dog that had seemed so harmless in the fog. Even in the candlelit parlors, the shadow of unease lingered, though it was softened by trust in the physician's authority. Servants exchanged furtive glances, and mothers lingered at the bedside, listening for faint sighs or movements, convinced by polite reason that nothing untoward would unfold. Outside, the fog pressed against windows and doorways, wrapping the city in silence. And in that silence, the disease continued its patient progression. By nightfall, the first threads of fear began to tug at the edges of confidence, subtle and almost imperceptible. The doctor's reassurance had delayed panic, but London would soon learn that authority, however calm and measured, could not withstand the quiet inevitability of hydrophobia. The bite had been delivered, the disease had taken hold, and the comfort of a physician's words could not alter the course that lay ahead. In the narrow alleys and courtyards of London, children played as they had for generations, unaware of the invisible hazard that threaded itself through their world. Their laughter echoed off brick walls, a fragile sound that seemed almost defiant in the pervasive fog. Yet, beneath the brightness of their games, danger moved quietly, imperceptible to the untrained eye. Dogs trotted alongside them, tails wagging, eyes alert, each an unsuspecting agent of a fate no child could comprehend. To the city, these interactions were ordinary. To the disease, they were the instruments of its inexorable spread. Parents attempted to supervise, though their vigilance was tempered by the belief that domestic life, polite instruction, and attentiveness could stave off misfortune. Children were warned not to approach strays, yet familiarity bred carelessness. A friendly nuzzle, a gentle scratch on the hand, a momentary distraction, and the bite was delivered. The small teeth pierced skin with innocuous ease, leaving only a red mark, an impression so faint it might be forgotten in the morning bustle. London's households relied on the familiar. the comforting routines that masked the slow encroachment of danger. Servants, ever alert to the health and comfort of those in their care, began to notice subtleties: a child reluctant to drink from a cup, a tremor in a hand as they reached for bread, an unusual agitation that flitted across the nursery. They whispered to each other in hushed tones, careful not to alarm the family, knowing the weight of propriety demanded composure. Yet the disease moved past observation, invisible, patient, as relentless as the tide, slipping through the smallest lapses, claiming victims with quiet certainty. Medical men recorded cases in antiseptic journals with precision, noting the symptoms of fever, agitation, and later, the unmistakable fear of water. They prescribed bitters, tonics, and laudanum, hoping to ease the agitation, unaware that their remedies touched only the surface, leaving the root of the affliction unchallenged. The earliest manifestations, restless nights, trembling limbs, subtle changes in behavior, were often dismissed as minor indispositions, harmless enough to be tolerated until progression could no longer be ignored. In the streets, dogs continued their ordinary routines, oblivious to the terror they carried. A passerby might pat a dog's head, the child giggling at its playful energy, never knowing that the momentary touch had delivered a quiet verdict. The city's rhythm market cries, cartwheels, the distant toll of church bells continued without interruption, a deceptive backdrop to a crisis unfolding in miniature within households across London. By twilight, a subtle tension began to infiltrate homes. Mothers lingered beside cradles and nursery chairs, watching over children who, in the gaslight's flicker, appeared restless and uneasy. The servants' quiet vigilance persisted, their eyes following every twitch, every hesitation, every glance toward water. And still, outside, the fog enveloped the streets, concealing the very agents of the city's dread. Children and pets moved together, companions in innocence, unwitting bearers of a sentence that would unfold with merciless precision. London, confident in its routines, its propriety, and its authority, could not yet perceive the full measure of the threat. Yet the disease, patient and invisible, had begun its work, claiming entry through the smallest breach. The bite, the scratch, the seemingly harmless moment, these were the first acts in a drama of inevitable horror, played out silently, beneath gaslight, fog, and the polite civility of a city that had yet to understand the quiet terror stalking its youngest and most vulnerable. By the third week, the quiet unease that had threaded through London's parlours and alleys began to harden into grim reality. Reports came in, whispered from household to household, from the chemist to the surgeon, and along the gaslit streets where the fog had taken on a sinister patience, the first unmistakable fatalities of hydrophobia were recorded not as spectacle, but as a slow, inexorable acknowledgement that the disease had claimed dominion over life. Families who had once dismissed minor scratches or playful bites now faced a terror that could not be reasoned away, soothed with laudanum or hidden beneath the fragrant curtains of propriety. A child, no more than 8, had grown restless in the night. At first, it was only subtle, a twitch of a hand, a quiet whimper when brought near water. By morning, delirium had claimed him entirely, his small body trembling against the fever's heat, eyes wide with terror unconnected to anything visible. Mothers in neighboring houses spoke in hushed tones of the boy who would not drink, who recoiled at the simplest gesture of care. Servants moved quietly, unsure whether to assist or to maintain the decorum demanded by Victorian propriety. The household, once confident in the protection of routine and medical authority, now found itself confronted with the impossible. Death had arrived, patient and indifferent. Doctors arrived, consulted with measured calm, and observed with antiseptic precision. Their words, intended to soothe, seemed hollow against the reality of the first fatalities. Remedies were administered: bitters, poultices, laudanum, but the disease advanced with a quiet inevitability that defied intervention. The city's faith in its medical men faltered, for the authority of knowledge could not contend with the invisible teeth of a dog that had seemed harmless only days before. The fog that wrapped London's streets seemed now to carry a different weight. Whispers travelled more quickly than any cart or letter. The baker's boy, the child of the grocer, the errant companion who had trotted through alleys and markets each became the subject of hushed fear. People spoke cautiously, careful not to invoke panic, yet unable to ignore the mounting reality. These early deaths were not loud, not dramatic. They were quiet, merciless, and definitive. Servants kept a careful watch over households, their eyes alert to every tremor, every hesitation, every glance toward a cup of water. Families shuttered windows, barred doors, and restricted access to animals. Yet the city could not fully contain the threat. In each home, the first fatalities became a silent lesson. The disease was neither arbitrary nor forgiving. Even the most minor bite, the most inconsequential scratch, could blossom into delirium, terror, and death. London, so confident in its routines and its propriety, began to feel the edges of panic pressing beneath its surface. Gas lamps flickered, alleyways seemed narrower, and the fog carried a weight that was almost tactile, as if the city itself recognized the invisible menace within its streets. The first fatalities were not merely numbers recorded in a ledger, they were a turning point, a quiet acknowledgement that the city had been touched by a force beyond comprehension. Hydrophobia had arrived, and with it, the certainty that polite conversation, medical authority, and careful observation were powerless before its inexorable advance. By the end of the first month, an unspoken tension had begun to settle over London, as if the fog itself had grown heavier, pressing into the narrow streets and alleyways with a sinister deliberation. The city moved outwardly unchanged, carts rattled over cobblestones, merchants hawked their wares, and the polite laughter of children echoed across gaslit squares. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, a quiet anxiety threaded through every household, every parlor, and every nursery. The first fatalities of hydrophobia had shattered the fragile illusion that minor bites and scratches were inconsequential. Now, even the most mundane movements were watched with suspicion, and the city began to feel, collectively, a subtle disquiet that was nearly palpable. Families who had once dismissed a scratch or a playful nip now spoke of them in hushed tones, their words careful, laden with an anxious civility. Mothers pressed children close, servants observed every twitch and tremor, and the city's doctors recorded cases with increasing frequency, their antiseptic detachment tinged with unease. The disease, once invisible, had begun to assert itself with an authority that no ledger could counter, a patient inevitability that spread silently yet surely through the lives of ordinary Londoners. Even those untouched by the bite or scratch felt its presence, a shadow moving through the gaslight, hinting at dangers that polite conversation could not fully name. In the streets, dogs moved as they always had, trotting along alleys and marketplaces with innocuous purpose. Yet they were no longer merely animals, they had become agents of invisible terror. Citizens, once indifferent to the presence of animals in the public thoroughfares, now eyed them with suspicion, guiding children away, whispering cautions that carried more weight than usual. The subtle recognition of threat transformed ordinary life into a careful negotiation with uncertainty. Every encounter with a familiar companion might conceal a fatal secret, every bite or scratch a possible sentence. Public spaces took on a new dimension of anxiety. Markets were quieter than usual. Passers-by lingered less in conversation, fearful that the smallest contact could invite danger. Servants moved more cautiously, their eyes constantly scanning the street, the alleys, the wagons, and the dogs that passed by. Even the city's clergy felt a shift in their congregations. Parishioners whispered of the unseen menace, of hydrophobia, of the first deaths that had arrived with quiet inevitability. Faith offered little comfort against a terror so imperceptible, so patient, and so absolute in its certainty. By nightfall, London felt as though it were holding its breath. Gas lamps flickered against the thickening fog, casting long, uncertain shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Families drew curtains, locked doors, and whispered assurances to each other, while the servants continued their quiet vigilance. The early fatalities, the subtle signs, the hushed conversations, they all coalesced into an atmosphere of uneasy anticipation. The city's confidence, once absolute, now wavered under the weight of the invisible and the inevitable. In the silence between lamp-posts and beneath the gaslit windows, the city awaited what it could not yet see, the inexorable progression of a disease that respected neither wealth, status, nor propriety. London had been touched by hydrophobia, and the unease that pressed upon it was a promise. What had begun quietly in scratches and bites would soon unfold with merciless clarity, leaving a city forever altered, a society forced to reckon with terror that no authority could fully contain. The streets of London, usually alive with the rhythmic clatter of boots and the distant hum of carriage wheels, had begun to assume a different character. Fog hung low, curling around lamp-posts and draping itself over doorways, muting the city's familiar sounds, and carrying in its stillness a subtle, pervasive unease. The citizens moved as always, tradesmen hawking goods, children darting between alleys, servants gliding silently between households, but beneath the surface, every shadow, every motion, carried the potential for unseen menace. The invisible teeth of a dog that had seemed harmless now pressed upon the city, their presence hinted at by the faintest tremor of a hand, the restless gaze of a child, or the sudden hesitation of a passer-by. Dogs, companions, and familiars of everyday life had become instruments of fear. Once playful and benign, they now prowled the fog-shrouded streets with a quiet agency. Their paws left no traces that indicated danger, their barks no warning beyond what society had always considered ordinary. The city's inhabitants, untrained in the subtle signs of infection, could not yet perceive that each encounter might bear consequences far beyond a scratch or nip. Mothers clasped children to their sides, servants diverted them from stray animals, and even the wealthier households, confident in their walls and gates, felt the intrusive pressure of a menace they could not name. Medical authorities had begun to note cases with increasing frequency. Ledgers filled with antiseptic precision documented restlessness, fevers, and agitation among the youngest victims. Yet even as these accounts accumulated, there was little the physicians could do. Remedies, both common and arcane, were applied with care. Tonics, laudanum, poultices, and careful observation. The city's faith in its medical men provided a fragile shield of reassurance, yet the invisible predator moved undeterred. Streets were full of teeth, yet invisible ones, patient and inexorable, passing from hand to hand, from child to pet, and from pet to child, in a silent, merciless cycle. By midweek, whispers had spread along alleys and through the parlours of London. Households spoke in cautious tones of dogs whose teeth carried a hidden menace, of children restless and fevered, of neighbours struck suddenly with symptoms that could not be explained. Even the most composed citizens found their confidence shaken. The city's rhythm, its polite routines, seemed to falter under the quiet pressure of pervasive dread. Servants moved with heightened awareness, noting every twitch, every hesitation, every glance toward a cup of water. Evening brought a suffocating stillness. The fog thickened, as if aware of its role in concealing the true danger, winding through streets and clinging to shutters and eaves. Gas lamps flickered in uncertainty, shadows stretching long and thin, the city itself seeming to hold its breath. London, confident in its propriety and its authority, now discovered the limits of both. Streets full of teeth were no longer a figure of speech. They were the reality of a city under quiet siege, where every moment carried the possibility of a bite, a scratch, and an unalterable sentence. And in the silence between the familiar sounds of commerce and daily life, The patient inevitability of the disease advanced, moving unseen, untouchable, and entirely merciless. The city could not yet perceive it, but London was being quietly, irrevocably transformed. Time in London had taken on an uneven cadence, measured not by clocks or church bells, but by the subtle rhythms of unease that threaded through every household. The city's fog, heavy and persistent, seemed to stretch minutes into hours, curling through narrow alleys and pressing against the shutters of townhouses, wrapping the streets in a suffocating stillness. In parlors perfumed with lavender and warmed by coal fires, families moved with careful attention to routine, clinging to the belief that normalcy could shelter them from the invisible threat. And yet, beneath this fragile veneer, the comfort of delay so treasured in polite society allowed the disease to take root with merciless patience. A child, scratched days before by a dog whose teeth had seemed innocuous, stirred uneasily in bed. Fever whispered through his small body, bringing restless tossing and faint moans. Yet his mother, convinced of the triviality of minor injuries, soothed him with gentle reassurances. "It is nothing," she whispered, pressing a cool hand to his brow. Servants adjusted blankets, offered warm milk, and whispered to each other in hushed concern, careful not to alarm the household with the knowledge that the danger had already begun its quiet work. In this delay, in this false confidence, the city's peril found its foothold. Medical men documented cases with their customary precision, recording temperature, pulse, and agitation in neat, antiseptic journals. Remedies were administered with care, tonics to restore calm, poultices to ease discomfort, and laudanum to quiet restless nerves. These measures, though intended to comfort, were powerless against the disease's slow and patient progression. London's faith in authority, in the measured hands of its doctors, allowed families to maintain their routines, oblivious to the subtle, insidious march of hydrophobia. Outside, the streets continued their usual patterns. Merchants called their wares from carts, children laughed and darted between buildings, and dogs trotted along alleys, wagging tails and noses pressed to the ground. To an observer untrained in the invisible threat, all seemed ordinary. Yet each passing moment was an opportunity for transmission, a chance for the unseen predator to take hold. The comfort of delay, of believing that a minor bite was insignificant, that the city's routines offered protection, was, in reality, a cruel accomplice to the inevitable. Evening brought a heavy quiet, the fog pressing more insistently into corners and across squares. Households drew shutters and curtains, closed doors against the chill, and whispered of minor illnesses, attributing restless nights to fatigue or mild fever. Servants observed children's behavior with an attentiveness born of necessity, noting every twitch, every hesitation, and every glance toward water. Yet the disease moved regardless, indifferent to the rituals of protection or the reassurances of authority. In the hush of the night, the city's illusion of safety held, fragile but persistent. Families rested in their beds, confident that care and vigilance would protect them. Outside, the fog swirled, the gas lamps flickered, and the patient, invisible menace advanced quietly, inexorably. The comfort of delay allowed Londoners to ignore what had already begun, the slow, merciless progression of a disease that would turn the ordinary into terror, and the familiar into the harbinger of death. Weeks passed over London with a deceptive languor, the fog curling through alleys and pressing against windows, concealing the city's growing apprehension beneath its familiar shroud. Life continued as always, or appeared to. Children ran through narrow streets, their laughter echoing off brick and stone, while merchants hawked wares and servants moved quietly from home to home, attending to duties with an air of practiced composure. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, a slow and merciless tide advanced, the waiting weeks that would separate the innocuous bite from the unmistakable onset of hydrophobia. The city, patient in its routine, had no inkling of the clock that now ticked invisibly within the bodies of the unsuspecting. Families clung to comfort in routine. Mothers pressed children close in their laps, offering tea and blankets, soothing fevered brows with a tender touch. Doctors advised rest, nourishment, and cleanliness, noting minor irritability or agitation, with antiseptic detachment in their journals. The advice was sound, yet impotent. The disease advanced in silence, its progress imperceptible, threading through nerves and blood without leaving any mark that polite observation could detect. Londoners, reassured by propriety and trust in authority, dismissed the faint signs as trifles, unaware that each day of delay brought the inevitable closer with patient insistence. In the nurseries and parlours, subtle signs began to emerge. A child might twitch slightly when offered water, or recoil at a sudden movement. Fingers trembled, eyelids fluttered, and restless nights stretched into uneasy mornings. Yet these symptoms were so faint, so easily attributed to minor indispositions, that they were often ignored or rationalized. A restless night, a mother would say, a mild fever, nothing more. Servants observed with quiet concern, noting these small deviations, whispering to one another, but maintaining the outward appearance of composure. The city's rhythm, its manners, and its routines all conspired to allow the disease to progress unnoticed. Outside, the streets continued their ordinary bustle, the fog softening sounds and shaping shadows into deceptive familiarity. Dogs padded along the wet stones, wagging tails and bright eyes masking the danger they carried. Passers-by glanced but rarely noticed the subtle shifts, the invisible hazard hidden in the ordinary. London, confident in its order and propriety, failed to perceive the patient work of the disease, moving quietly from body to body, waiting for the precise moment when its impact would become undeniable. By the end of these weeks, the city began to feel the shift in its own pulse. Conversations in parlours grew quieter, cautious. Glances toward doors and windows were more frequent, more wary. Families whispered of neighbours stricken suddenly with fever and agitation, of children who no longer drank water without terror, of a lethargy that could not be explained by ordinary illness. The waiting weeks had served their purpose. The disease, patient and meticulous, had taken hold in unsuspecting bodies, setting the stage for the horror that would soon erupt with unstoppable clarity. London's illusion of safety, nurtured by routine and trust in medical authority, now trembled. The city, still outwardly composed, had already begun to reckon with a silent, inexorable force, and the waiting weeks had ensured that when the time came, fear would no longer be avoidable. In the quiet confines of his study, beneath the dim glow of gas lamps, the physician of a London borough paused from his meticulous note-taking. The journals before him, lined with precise entries of temperature, pulse, and behavior, now bore the first unmistakable signs of unease. Though his words were measured, antiseptic, and proper, the hand that recorded them trembled ever so slightly, betraying a private anxiety he would never voice aloud. In public, he remained composed, a pillar of authority. In private, however, he felt the weight of a disease that no remedy could check and no observation could fully anticipate. Outside his study, the city carried on with its customary rhythm. Servants glided through corridors, children played in the narrow courtyards, and merchants called their wares along fogged streets. To the untrained eye, life appeared undisturbed. Yet the physician knew differently. Beneath the cobblestones, beneath the mist that clung to the river and wound its way between houses, an invisible predator moved with patient deliberation. Each bite, each scratch, each playful nip of a dog that seemed innocuous carried the promise of terror, weeks in the making. Londoners, oblivious, continued their routines, trusting in their doctors, unaware that even the most learned of men could offer only reassurance, not protection. He reflected on the cases that had come under his care. Children who had seemed merely restless, with minor abrasions that could be dismissed as trifles, now exhibited subtle signs that could not be ignored. Trembling hands, a refusal to drink, agitation that defied explanation. Mothers, anxious yet obedient to his guidance, followed his instructions with near religious precision, unaware that his calm voice masked the deep unease he carried in private. He had administered tonics, laudanum, poultices, and careful observation, yet the disease pressed forward, indifferent to remedies or the authority of man. The study felt smaller than usual, the gaslight flickering against rows of glass bottles and neat ledgers. Each shadow seemed alive, dancing along the walls, like the whisper of something unseen. The doctor's thoughts circled with relentless insistence. A child who had been bitten, a neighbor's son who had grown fevered overnight, the subtle agitation in a household servant who had been scratched while walking a dog along the misted alley. The city's faith in his authority weighed upon him, a fragile scaffold that could not withstand the certainty he now recognized in his private moments. The disease was patient, meticulous, and unstoppable. He rose and moved to the window, peering out over rooftops slick with fog. Gas lamps glimmered like distant, uncertain stars, and the murmur of life continued unabated, oblivious to the threat threading through it. London, confident in propriety and order, did not yet sense the inexorable reach of hydrophobia. The physician's hand rested lightly on the sill, his mind restless with calculations, interventions, and prayers for those already imperiled. In private, he acknowledged what he could not say aloud. Certainty was a fragile illusion, and the city he had sworn to protect had already been touched by a quiet, merciless terror. The private anxiety that gripped him was not fear alone, but a measured dread born of knowledge, anticipation, and the awareness that the invisible was already at work. London's streets, its homes, and its gaslit parlours would soon awaken to this truth, but for now, only he bore the weight of what was to come. In the hush of London's parlours, beneath the pale flicker of gaslight, a subtle tension had begun to settle like dust on every surface. Mothers, who had once moved through their households with calm authority and gentle precision, now carried a quiet terror in their hearts, unspoken yet palpable. The disease had begun its silent work, threading through homes with the patience of a shadow, claiming the most vulnerable first. Children who had been scratched or bitten days or weeks before, now restless, fevered, and unaware of the danger coursing through them. Every mother, attuned to the smallest change in expression or movement, now listened with heightened vigilance to breaths, whispers, and the faintest tremors. No word could capture the dread that pressed upon them. Servants moved silently between rooms, aware of the mother's watchful eyes, the children's agitation, and the invisible menace that lurked beyond doors and windows. Families relied upon medical authority, the calm tones of doctors who reassured them that minor bites were often harmless, that proper care and observation would suffice. Yet even as advice was followed to the letter, the mothers could feel, in a manner that transcended reason, that something beyond their understanding had taken hold. The subtle twitch of a hand, the reluctant sip of water, the feverish flush on a child's cheek, all were magnified in perception, turning ordinary domestic moments into occasions of silent dread. In nurseries dimly lit by gas lamps, mothers hovered beside cradles, rocking children who would not settle, stroking their hair with trembling hands. Even the ordinary sounds of life, footsteps on wooden floors, the distant rumble of carts, the low murmur of neighbors, became carriers of unease, reminders that the world outside was no longer a safe space. Dogs, once companions, were now scrutinized, every wag of a tail or approach toward a child regarded with suspicion. The innocence of play had been replaced by caution, and the comfort of routine no longer offered solace. The city itself seemed to conspire with their fear. Fog pressed against window panes and wrapped around lampposts, muting the familiar sounds of daily life while amplifying the mother's sense of vulnerability. The streets, still filled with ordinary activity, were perceived as perilous, each shadow a possible threat, each passing dog a potential agent of doom. Mothers whispered to one another in hushed tones, exchanging accounts of minor bites, restless nights, and the early, inscrutable signs of hydrophobia. Their voices, careful and measured, could not mask the tremor of anxiety that ran beneath every word. Even in the presence of physicians whose authority was absolute, the mother's terror remained. Tonics and laudanum, careful observation, and detailed instructions offered temporary reassurance, but could not counteract the patient, inexorable progression of the disease. They watched as the subtle changes they had once ignored, small twitches, unusual agitation, a hesitation at water, now escalated with a quiet inevitability that could not be contained. By nightfall, the mother's quiet terror had become a force unto itself, a vigilant watch that could neither prevent nor fully understand the coming horror. Every corner of the household, every interaction, every glance toward a child or a pet was imbued with heightened awareness. London's domestic spaces, once safe havens, were now arenas of anticipation, where patience, attentiveness, and gentle care were powerless against a menace that moved invisibly, indiscriminately, and with merciless precision. Night in London carried a weight that only the servants of its household seemed fully to understand. While the city above slept beneath a haze of gaslight and fog, corridors and stairwells hummed softly with the careful tread of those tasked with the unseen work of domestic care. Their eyes, trained to notice the slightest tremor, the faintest gasp, the subtlest twitch, now caught details that even the most watchful mothers had failed to perceive. Each footfall, each whisper, each hesitant sigh from the children in their charge was magnified, a signal of the invisible menace already threading its way through the household. In the nurseries, young charges shifted restlessly, beneath quilts scented with lavender and warmed by the dying glow of coal. Servants, their hands steady but hearts tight with unspoken fear, hovered at the edges, observing without intrusion. They had learned, over the first weeks of the disease's quiet spread, that hydrophobia could arrive with almost imperceptible warning: a refusal to drink water, a sudden shiver, the flicker of eyelids in fevered sleep. The ordinary motions of tending, pouring warm milk, straightening blankets, adjusting a child's hair, now bore the weight of consequence. Each touch carried a potential risk, yet hesitation could be equally fatal. Outside the windows, fog pressed thickly against the panes, blurring the outlines of the gas lamps and casting uncertain shadows into the rooms below. The city appeared calm, the noises of distant carts, the low murmur of neighbors, and the occasional bark of a dog suggesting ordinary life. But the servants knew better. The danger was invisible. It moved quietly and patiently, indifferent to the routines of the household above. A dog that had appeared harmless during the day might carry within its small frame a sentence that would not reveal itself for weeks, yet would, without fail, assert its fatal authority once the incubation had passed. In kitchens and corridors, whispers were shared between trusted companions. A gentle caution regarding which child had been scratched, a note about restless sleep, the careful observation of behavior, all became matters of whispered record. These late-night vigils were silent, meticulous, and exhausting, yet indispensable. The servant's awareness acted as a fragile line of defense, a patient observation that could not prevent the disease but might delay its full impact, or at least provide a modicum of comfort to those above stairs. Even the smallest details became matters of import. The slight pallor of a child's hand, the tremor in a finger, the wary glance toward a bowl of water, all were recorded mentally, catalogued with care, and observed again at the next quiet interval. The servants moved with deliberate efficiency, conscious that their presence must not disturb the children or alarm the family, yet fully aware that their vigilance was the only shield against the silent terror that prowled within the walls. As the night deepened, and the gas lamps flickered against the fogged glass. A shared understanding passed among those who watched. The comfort of routine could no longer protect the household. The bite, the scratch, the invisible agent of death had already begun its patient work. The servants, ever watchful, continued their quiet rounds, their vigilance a testament to a knowledge no one else in the household yet possessed, bearing the weight of fear in silence while London slept, oblivious to the inexorable march of hydrophobia. The mornings in London's narrow streets began with the familiar clatter of carts over wet cobblestones and the muted chatter of vendors arranging their goods. Yet, even in this ordinary bustle, a subtle tension threaded through the city's commercial heart, carried on hushed whispers and the passing of notes from hand to hand. The chemists, those custodians of remedies and potions, were among the first to perceive the quiet weight of unease. Reports of restless children, minor bites, and the first unexplained fatalities now reached their counters, delivered in careful, measured tones by worried mothers, anxious servants, and occasionally by physicians themselves, their hands stained with ink and worry. Behind the polished shelves of glass bottles, powdered herbs, and tinctures, the chemists listened, recording the accounts with precise attention. Each description, a scratch, hardly deep, a fever, slight at first, aversion to water, was catalogued in neat ledgers, their antiseptic pages a fragile attempt to impose order on an unfolding chaos. The public, seeking reassurance in remedies, could not yet comprehend the significance of these reports. To them, the chemist's calm voice, the meticulous measure of powders, the careful mixing of syrups, suggested that the city's authority remained intact, that disease could be managed, controlled, and, perhaps, held at bay. Yet the men and women behind the counters knew otherwise. The accumulation of reports carried a quiet terror that no tonic or powder could alleviate. The patterns were subtle, but unmistakable, a progression from minor irritation to agitation, the reluctant sip of water, the fever that flared at night and faded by day. Hydrophobia had begun its patient work, threading through homes with invisible precision, and the chemists, privy to the accounts from multiple households, saw the danger as clearly as anyone could without observing the disease firsthand. Their eyes, trained to detect the faintest symptoms, caught in these reports a signal that the city itself had yet to recognize. Patrons came and went, purchasing remedies for coughs, colds, and minor ailments, unaware that a far more insidious threat now moved among them. Mothers brought children with fevered brows, servants whispered cautions, and physicians arrived with requests for tonics and powders to ease restlessness. The chemists complied, their hands steady, masks of authority carefully maintained, yet the ledger entries at the end of each day told another story. The city was in the early throes of a menace that no social order, no propriety, and no polite reassurance could fully contain. At dusk, the fog pressed in against windows and shop fronts, curling around gas lamps and dimming the familiar streets. Reports continued to arrive, each one a quiet note of warning. Chemists read them with careful eyes, recording symptoms, locations, and times, their pens moving steadily while their minds traced the invisible map of infection spreading silently through households across London. Even as routine transactions continued, the air in their shops seemed heavier. Each tincture dispensed a reminder that the disease's reach was growing, patient, and inexorable. By nightfall, the chemists closed their shutters with a muted weight, aware that the city beyond continued in ignorance. Reports reached them, voices softened and anxious, and though remedies were prepared, advice given, and assurances spoken, they understood in the quiet of their shops London's routine, its propriety, and its faith in authority could not forestall the inexorable spread of what had begun quietly but would not relent. The city, oblivious in daylight, slept beneath a menace that only the careful records and anxious attentiveness of these observers hinted at, a menace that would soon awaken the city to a terror it could no longer ignore. In the gaslit parlours and cramped infirmaries of Victorian London, confusion reigned behind a facade of antiseptic certainty. Children fidgeted in their beds, hands trembling ever so slightly, eyes darting away from the simplest cup of water. Fevers rose and fell in unpredictable rhythms, and yet the symptoms were subtle enough, at first, to be misattributed. Physicians, despite their training and authority, found themselves confounded by the early manifestations of the disease. Restlessness, agitation, slight tremors, these were symptoms that could signify fatigue, the common cold, or even emotional distress. And so the first cases of hydrophobia were often recorded as ordinary maladies, their true nature hidden beneath polite language and medical decorum. Parents, anxious yet trusting, followed the instructions of these men in white coats with unwavering diligence. Tonics were administered at prescribed intervals, poultices applied to ease discomfort, and laudanum offered as a balm for nerves frayed by sleepless nights. Yet even as these interventions were carried out with the utmost care, the disease advanced silently, like fog seeping into the corners of a house, invisible and inexorable. Each mistaken diagnosis, each reassurance that the child's agitation was temporary or trifling, allowed the disease to deepen its hold, patiently awaiting the moment when its presence would become undeniable. Servants, trained to observe every nuance of behavior, grew wary of symptoms that doctors dismissed. A sudden refusal to drink, a subtle convulsion in the hand, or a flinch at the sight of water were often explained away by household authorities as nothing more than nervousness or fatigue. Yet the careful eyes of those who watched over children in the quiet hours knew otherwise. They catalogued each deviation with silent anxiety, whispering their observations to each other in low tones, careful not to alarm the family above stairs. Their vigilance, though constant, could not halt the patient progression of the disease, merely mark its presence before the inevitable horror emerged. Outside, London moved with its accustomed rhythm, oblivious to the invisible force threading itself through its streets and homes. Dogs trotted along alleys and past markets, tails wagging, noses sniffing, carrying within their teeth a quiet sentence that would soon be enacted. Merchants hawked their wares, children played in narrow courtyards, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings, unaware that the innocuous movements of daily life masked a deadly precision. Mistaken diagnoses perpetuated the illusion of normalcy, allowing the disease to spread further before the city could recognize the scope of its peril. By nightfall, the quiet tension had thickened. Gas lamps flickered against fogged windows, casting long, uncertain shadows across streets and alleys. Inside, mothers whispered anxiously over fevered children. Servants moved with deliberate caution, and physicians reviewed their notes with increasing unease. The misattribution of early symptoms had given the disease the advantage it required, a patient window in which to establish itself. London's confidence in medical authority, once absolute, now trembled beneath the weight of a truth it was only beginning to perceive. Hydrophobia was no ordinary illness, and the city's first mistakes in diagnosis would carry consequences both silent and merciless. In the polished halls of London's gentlemen's clubs, the city's elite moved with the practiced ease of wealth and privilege, unaware of the subtle terror threading its way through the streets and alleys below. Richly upholstered armchairs, polished mahogany tables, and the faint scent of cigars and ink offered an air of civilized assurance, a barrier against the chaos of the wider city. Here, in these bastions of propriety, discussions ranged from politics to trade, literature to fashion, yet the invisible menace of hydrophobia remained largely unspoken, its presence relegated to hushed rumors circulating at the edges of polite conversation. Members of these clubs prided themselves on order and rationality. Disease, when mentioned, was discussed in antiseptic terms, a matter for physicians and apothecaries, not for men of reason and leisure. Yet the first fatalities had begun to touch the edges of their world, reaching beyond nurseries and working-class households into stories whispered between servants and conveyed cautiously to patrons. A footman might mention a neighbor's child, fevered and restless, bitten by a dog whose ordinary demeanor concealed a quiet death sentence. Such stories were repeated carefully, framed in the language of civility, yet beneath the polished veneer, unease took root. The gentlemen, seated in their velvet chairs, listened with polite interest, nodding occasionally, their expressions betraying only the slightest tension. Hydrophobia, they understood, was a disease of the lower orders, of children in cramped homes and pets wandering alleys. Yet the faint tremor in a story of a child refusing water, the subtle mention of fevered nights, carried a weight that could not be entirely dismissed. Their authority, drawn from wealth and education, could command respect in the parlor, but it could not shield them from the inexorable advance of a disease that respected neither lineage nor refinement. Servants within the clubs were alert to every movement, every cough, every twitch in the limbs of the younger sons or visiting children. They whispered among themselves, careful to maintain decorum, passing along observations of subtle agitation or fevered restlessness. The clubs themselves, with their ordered routines and measured atmosphere, provided no protection against a menace that moved quietly, invisibly, and with patient precision. Every minor incident, an accidental scratch, a nip from a seemingly harmless dog, was potentially the first note of a symphony of horror yet to be fully realized. By evening, as gas lamps flickered against the polished panels and shadows stretched across the rooms, the sense of unease grew. Conversations, once effortless and confident, took on a cautious edge. Even in these bastions of civility, stories of hydrophobia lingered like a damp chill beneath the velvet and mahogany. Patrons excused themselves early, their thoughts turning to family and children at home, and to the invisible teeth that moved through the city, patient and indiscriminate. Outside, London's fog thickened, curling through alleys and pressing against windows. The gentlemen's clubs remained insulated by wealth and propriety, yet even here a quiet recognition emerged. No authority, no education, no refinement could truly protect against a menace that moved unseen, and whose patience allowed it to strike with merciless inevitability. The disease, subtle and silent, had begun to encroach upon every layer of society, and the veneer of order could not long conceal the city's growing dread. As London grappled with its first fatalities and the subtle apprehension threading through households, news began to arrive from beyond the city's fog-bound streets, carried in ink and paper by postmen traversing the damp roads of the surrounding counties. Letters from the provinces, carefully sealed and addressed, bore accounts that mirrored the quiet terror unfolding within the metropolis, yet each carried the added weight of distance and uncertainty. Families in smaller towns described restless children, dogs that had bitten without consequence at first but later displayed the unmistakable signs of madness, and communities unnerved by a disease that appeared invisible, patient, and merciless. The letters were read in London's parlours with a polite composure that thinly veiled an underlying dread. Mothers and governesses leaned over ink-stained pages, absorbing accounts of symptoms they had already begun to notice in their own children: tremors, agitation, fevered nights, and the subtle aversion to water that no physician could fully explain. Servants, ever observant, glanced from the letter to the child in their care, noting the small deviations from routine, the restless movements, and the occasional twitch of a hand. Each provincial report acted as both warning and confirmation. The disease was not confined to the alleys of London. It moved silently, inexorably, through the nation's streets, nurseries, and homes. Physicians, upon receipt of these letters, added their observations to the meticulous ledgers already filling their offices. They recorded each instance of fever, agitation, and hydrophobia with antiseptic detachment, yet even in their precision, unease crept into the margins. Patterns emerged, subtle yet undeniable. Children first scratched, then fevered, then restless. Dogs that had seemed ordinary at first revealing themselves as instruments of the inevitable. Remedies, tonics, laudanum, poultices were prescribed as always, though their efficacy against this creeping menace remained illusory. London's confidence in medical authority, once absolute, now showed cracks beneath the patient and unyielding advance of disease. In households across the city, mothers discussed the letters in hushed tones. "It is happening beyond our streets," they whispered. And yet the same shadow moves here as well. The awareness of a threat extending from the provinces to the city intensified the quiet vigilance that had begun to dominate domestic life. Children were monitored closely, pets observed with suspicion, and servants moved with deliberate caution, their attentiveness now heightened by reports from towns and villages where the disease had already asserted its merciless dominion. Outside, the fog clung to cobblestones and doorways, muffling the sounds of ordinary life and wrapping the streets in an uneasy silence. The letters from the provinces carried more than news. They carried foreboding, a sense of inevitability that London could not yet fully confront. The disease had travelled invisibly, patiently, from distant towns to the capital, threading itself through households with merciless precision. By the time night fell, the city's awareness of the invisible threat had deepened. Londoners realized, if only dimly, that the patient menace of hydrophobia respected neither distance nor propriety, neither wealth nor routine. Letters from the provinces, inked in careful script, carried the quiet weight of warning. The disease had begun its inexorable work, and the city, with all its gaslight and order, would soon feel the full measure of a terror that moved unseen yet unyielding. From one household to the next, the fog in London was no mere atmospheric curiosity. It was a shroud, a slow-moving companion that pressed against windows, crept beneath doors, and wound itself around the city's narrow streets. By day, it dulled the colors of the bricks and slate, softening the edges of commerce and chatter into a muted palette. By night, it thickened, wrapping lamp-posts in ghostly halos, muting the distant rumble of carriages, and carrying with it a sense of unseen movement that made the ordinary extraordinary and the familiar unfamiliar. It was within this fog that the invisible menace of hydrophobia moved, patient and unrelenting, slipping from alley to doorway, from dog to child, unseen and untouchable, its progress hidden beneath the veil of the city's own breath. Families shuttered windows more tightly, the faint hiss of damp gas leaking through cracks in the panes, a reminder that the fog could enter where doors could not. Mothers leaned close to children, counting the shallow breaths, adjusting blankets with nervous precision. Servants moved silently, casting quick glances toward doorways and windows, noting the occasional silhouette of a dog wandering through the mist, its form diminished, distorted, almost spectral. The city's rhythm continued, but beneath its surface, awareness had shifted. Ordinary life now existed alongside an invisible tension, a quiet fear that pressed insistently against every household. In the markets and along narrow alleys, fog masked the ordinary signs of existence. The careful arrangements of goods, the familiar chatter of neighbors, the bark of dogs whose teeth carried death without discernible warning. Children darted between legs, their laughter more tentative than usual, while adults, attuned to the subtle cues of a restless city, moved with guarded deliberation. What had once seemed safe, a casual pat, a friendly scratch, a stroll along a familiar street, now carried the latent risk of disease, hidden, patient, and invisible. The fog concealed it all, and with concealment came a deceptive sense of security. Physicians, reading reports from the city and the provinces, recognized the pattern in the symptoms: slight agitation, fevered hands, reluctance to drink, and subtle tremors in the limbs. Remedies were prescribed as always, and advice issued with measured calm. Yet within the fog, the disease continued its patient advance, moving as imperceptibly as the vapor itself, passing from pets to children, from household to household, waiting for the moment when the ordinary would collapse into the extraordinary. London's reliance on authority, on routine, and on propriety offered only the illusion of protection. By nightfall, the gas lamps glimmered dimly through the murk, casting uncertain shadows along the wet cobbles. Families whispered in parlours, servants lingered in corridors, and the children slept fitfully, caught between warmth and the invisible threat pressing against them. Outside, the fog continued its silent drift, a companion to the disease, concealing every bite, every scratch, every subtle tremor, until the moment of revelation. London, still confident in its routines and propriety, remained unaware that the very air itself had become an accomplice to the patient, merciless advance of hydrophobia. The public parks of London, spaces once considered safe havens for children and leisure, had begun to assume a different character under the city's thickening fog. Morning walks, once a routine pleasure, now carried an undertone of unease, the gaslight and early sun struggling through the mist to illuminate damp paths. Dogs, previously companions of comfort and amusement, trotted through these open spaces with quiet purpose, oblivious to the danger they carried. The small scratches and playful bites that had seemed harmless during the day were now understood, in retrospect, to be the first whispers of a sentence that would unfold with merciless precision. Mothers who once strolled confidently along these promenades now kept their children close, hands tightly gripping sleeves and skirts, eyes scanning every shadow for movement. Servants, if accompanying them, watched both child and pet with a vigilance born of necessity, noting each wag of a tail, each quickened step, each glance from a dog that had once been considered benign. Even the park benches, the carefully raked gravel, and the ornamental fountains seemed complicit in the quiet terror, muffling the ordinary sounds of life, while the invisible menace threaded its way through the city's veins. Reports from provincial towns began to arrive with greater frequency, recounting incidents similar to those now observed in the parks of London. Children bitten by dogs appeared restless within days, fevered at night, and increasingly fearful of water. The physicians, precise and methodical, recorded these early cases with antiseptic detachment, their journals filled with entries noting agitation, tremors, and delirium. Remedies were prescribed, instructions issued, yet the disease advanced silently, indifferent to the authority of men in white coats or the careful watch of mothers and servants. The parks, spaces of apparent safety, had become arenas of quiet danger. Each walk, each encounter with a dog, a potential vector for the invisible sentence. Street vendors and passers-by, oblivious to the subtle menace, continued their routines. Dogs ran along cobblestones, chased balls or one another, and nipped playfully at children who squealed in delight. To the untrained eye, life proceeded with normality, yet each movement carried a risk invisible to the casual observer. The patient advance of hydrophobia depended on precisely this ignorance, exploiting trust, routine, and the city's confidence in propriety to embed itself before its effects could be recognized. By evening, the fog pressed even more insistently into the parks, curling around wrought iron fences, the trunks of leafless trees, and the distant silhouettes of walking ladies and their charges. Mothers returned home, carrying children who had been scratched, bitten, or merely brushed by a dog that now carried death silently in its teeth. Servants escorted them with careful vigilance, aware of the subtle tremors, the reluctant sips of water, the restlessness that had begun to unsettle even the most composed households. The parks, once symbols of civility and leisure, now bore witness to the quiet spread of a patient, invisible menace. In these hours, London began to perceive, in fragments and whispers, that the ordinary could conceal a sentence, that the familiar companion could deliver inexorable judgment, and that every corner of the city, every park, alley, and home was vulnerable to a danger it could neither see nor forestall. The children, the pets, the fog, and the patient disease moved together in a silent convergence. ensuring that the comfort of daylight and open air offered no true reprieve from the merciless inevitability of hydrophobia. The market squares of London, usually alive with the clatter of carts, the calls of vendors, and the shuffling of eager shoppers, had begun to hum with a quieter, more anxious energy. The fog, thick and persistent, curled between stalls and pressed against the faces of the crowd, softening voices and muting the ordinary sounds of commerce. It was here, amid baskets of fruit, barrels of grain, and the familiar sense of fresh bread and coal smoke, that the invisible menace of hydrophobia began to manifest in ways the city could not yet fully comprehend. Every dog that trotted among the stalls, every stray that padded unnoticed between legs and crates, carried a potential sentence, and yet no one recognized the danger until it was almost too late. Mothers clutched the hands of children as they navigated the crowded alleys between vendors. Their eyes darted toward dogs whose movements had once seemed benign, now regarded with suspicion. Children, oblivious to the invisible threat, reached toward baskets of apples or leaned to peer at passing animals, unaware that the smallest contact, a scratch, a playful nip, a brush of fur, could carry within it the first whisper of a sentence. Servants, accompanying families for guidance and protection, moved cautiously through the stalls, their eyes alert for any signs of agitation, fever, or unusual behavior in the children they watched over. The fog and the bustle together concealed and amplified the threat, creating a tension that seemed to ripple through the crowd like a hidden current. Merchants, intent on the sale of goods, noticed subtle changes among their customers, mothers hesitating, children reluctant to reach for fruit, the faint tremor in the hands of a young boy. These observations were recorded in passing, spoken quietly between shopkeepers, yet the city at large continued to function with a deceptive calm. The invisible disease threaded through the market, unnoticed, patient in its advance, exploiting the ordinary interactions and the unawareness of the citizens to establish its hold. Even the most vigilant observation, the most cautious supervision, could not entirely forestall the quiet spread of its influence. By midday, a mild panic began to take shape, subtle and understated, yet unmistakable to those attuned to its signs. Families whispered to each other, cautioning against stray animals, recounting rumors from the provinces, and exchanging stories of children suddenly restless, fevered, or unwilling to drink. The city's physicians, inundated with reports from homes and businesses, noted the early patterns: agitation, restlessness, subtle convulsions, and the unmistakable avoidance of water. Remedies, tonics, laudanum, poultices were dispensed, advice given, but the disease's patient, unyielding progression continued. As evening descended, gas lamps flickered against the damp streets, casting long shadows over emptied stalls and puddled cobblestones. The market squares, once symbols of vitality and routine, now bore the weight of apprehension. Families returned home with children and companions, alert to every twitch, every hesitation, every glance toward water. The bustling heart of the city had begun to sense the quiet terror threading through it. Hydrophobia had reached beyond the alleys, into the spaces of daily life, infiltrating the ordinary, and London would never regard its streets with the same innocence again. Within the hearth-lit confines of London homes, the comfort of routine had become both a shield and a peril. Mothers and governesses moved with care, arranging pillows, preparing meals, and attending to children with a precision that masked a growing anxiety. The daily rhythms, the measured pouring of tea, the gentle tucking in of blankets, the reading of stories by flickering candlelight, offered a fragile sense of normality. Yet beneath this semblance of order, the patient menace of hydrophobia had already begun its work, waiting in the smallest scratches, the faintest abrasions, and the subtle, nearly imperceptible tremors of children whose exposure had been deemed trivial. Servants, acutely aware of the early signs, maintained a quiet vigilance that threaded through every household task. They moved along hallways and staircases with careful deliberation, observing the children in their charge, noting the restless motions, the fevered sighs, and the moments of sudden agitation. Every action was measured. Every gesture carried the weight of possibility. A misplaced hand, a casual brush against a child, or an absent-minded glance toward water could mark the first step in a trajectory the household could not yet recognize. Yet the rhythm of domestic life, comforting and familiar, provided a deceptive illusion that the danger had not yet arrived. Physicians' advice reinforced this fragile calm. Remedies were dispensed with meticulous care, and instructions followed with religious devotion. Tonics for mild fever, laudanum to soothe restlessness, poultices to ease discomfort. Each intervention offered reassurance, yet none could penetrate the invisible advance of the disease. Hydrophobia moved in silence, threading its way through nerves and sinews, patient and unrelenting, indifferent to the diligence of servants, the attentiveness of mothers, or the antiseptic confidence of physicians. The comfort of delay, once a source of reassurance, had become a tool of cruel complicity, allowing the disease time to take hold before its presence could be acknowledged. Evenings were filled with quiet observation. Children were tucked in under heavy quilts, mothers whispered softly by candlelight, and servants lingered in corridors, ears tuned to every breath, every murmur, every restless movement. In homes of wealth and modest means alike, the subtle signs of disease were noted but not yet fully understood. Trembling fingers, fleeting convulsions, reluctance to drink. Each sign, though small, foreshadowed the inevitability of what was to come. The patient, invisible threat exploited the city's reliance on routine, on propriety, and on trust in authority. Outside, the fog pressed against windows and wound its way through streets, concealing the silent movements of dogs and the unseen reach of the disease. London's houses, with their gas lamps and polished floors, offered no immunity. The comfort of delay lulled families into a false sense of security, while the invisible predator worked steadily, ensuring that when the time of reckoning arrived, fear would come fully formed, unstoppable, and merciless. In these homes, the patient vigilance of mothers and servants met the inexorable patience of the disease, and the city, confident in its domestic order, remained unaware that the hour of revelation was drawing near, and with it, the undeniable reality of hydrophobia. In the quiet, lamp-lit offices of London's physicians, the ledger had become an instrument of mounting dread. Each carefully inscribed entry, penned with deliberate precision, recorded a small tragedy: a child scratched, a minor bite noted, a slight fever observed, a refusal to drink. The antiseptic neatness of ink on paper belied the gravity of what it contained. Each line, sterile and orderly, concealed the inexorable progress of a disease that no remedy could halt, a patient and invisible force that respected neither social rank, propriety, nor the measured authority of the medical man. By midweek, the ledgers had grown dense with observations. Physicians recorded not only the symptoms themselves, but the subtle progression: restless sleep, agitation, faint tremors in hands and limbs, the first hesitation at a cup of water, the pallor that seeped into cheeks and fingertips. Remedies were noted alongside each case: tonics, poultices, and the occasional draught of laudanum, prescribed to soothe the nerves and quiet restless agitation. Yet the very act of recording could not impede the disease. The ledger, for all its neatness and order, became a testament to helplessness, a chronicle of certainty in a city clinging desperately to illusion. Mothers and families, visiting physicians with careful obedience, watched as the first entries were made. They clutched children to their bosoms, smoothed fevered brows, whispered soft reassurances, and prayed that the authority of the doctor could forestall what they sensed but could not fully see. Servants, standing by in quiet vigilance, noted every twitch, every sigh, every faint shiver, knowing that these small details, though minor in isolation, were recorded in the ledger with meticulous care, forming a record of the disease's patient conquest. The ledger captured what polite conversation could not: the creeping, inexorable certainty that hydrophobia would claim dominion over the bodies it touched. Evening brought a dimness to the office, gas lamps casting uncertain shadows across the shelves of bottles and the spread of open ledgers. The physician paused, quill hovering over the page, observing a faint tremor in a child's hand through the window, noting the subtle twitch in a parent's wrist. He wrote in silence, aware that the ledger itself could not protect, could not reassure, could not intervene. Each carefully measured word, each meticulous description, bore witness to a patient, invisible threat that would continue its work regardless of human observation or care. Outside, the fog clung to the streets, to the edges of homes, and to the animals that roamed the city in unsuspected purpose. Dogs, once companions, carried the invisible sentence, and the ledger recorded only the consequences, never the mechanism, never the inevitability. London, confident in propriety, routine, and authority, remained outwardly composed, yet within the physician's office, the growing ledger captured the truth in quiet, unassailable detail. The city was being claimed by a patient, merciless disease, and no discipline, no ritual, no observation could alter its course. By nightfall, as the city slept beneath the fog and gaslight, the physician closed the ledger with care, the faint weight of dread pressing upon him. Each entry, precise and antiseptic, was a small monument to inevitability, a record of lives touched by invisible teeth, a city slowly awakening to the merciless certainty of hydrophobia. The streets of London, usually alive with the careful routines of polite society, had begun to carry a subtle tension that threaded itself from one household to the next. Neighbors, long accustomed to observing one another only in brief nods or whispered pleasantries over garden walls, now cast furtive glances into windows, noting the restless movements of children, the pale pallor of a hand, the slight tremor of a servant's fingers. The comfort of delay, so often relied upon to soothe fears and maintain appearances, had become a delicate illusion, allowing the invisible menace of hydrophobia to spread quietly between homes, while the city clung desperately to the belief that ordinary care and observation could forestall calamity. Families moved with careful deliberation, maintaining routines even as anxiety pressed upon them. Mothers whispered to one another across fences and through half-open windows, sharing stories of minor bites, restlessness, and fevered nights. Each anecdote was carefully framed, polite, measured, and suffused with the veneer of reason, yet beneath the words lay a creeping dread. The subtle delays, the unrecognized early symptoms, and the patient waiting for the disease's true form to manifest all combined to create a fragile sense of security that masked the inexorable advance of death. Children, unaware of the hidden threat, continued to play, their laughter echoing faintly across cobblestones, yet every interaction carried a quiet peril: the brush of a dog's fur, the playful nip of a companion animal, the careless scratch that no adult noticed. Servants, moving between households and streets alike, became the silent observers of this invisible menace. Their vigilance extended beyond the confines of their assigned homes, noting subtle signs in neighboring children, quietly sharing observations with one another in whispers that carried down narrow alleys. These quiet exchanges, unremarkable to outsiders, formed the early intelligence network of a city learning, slowly, to perceive a threat that could not yet be named with certainty. Even as the city maintained appearances, these small observations ensured that the spread of disease was quietly monitored, if not prevented. Physicians, already burdened with the increasing volume of cases, now began receiving indirect reports from neighbors, a network of anecdotes that confirmed what was feared, but not yet fully visible. Hydrophobia was moving through the city with patient insistence, exploiting the delays inherent in observation and social routine. Remedies were prescribed as always: measured tonics, laudanum for agitation, poultices for discomfort. Yet the invisible agent advanced relentlessly, indifferent to authority, propriety, or vigilance. By evening, the city's fog deepened, curling around windows, lampposts, and doorways with a suffocating intimacy. Families retreated indoors, children tucked beneath quilts, mothers whispering reassurances that belied the anxiety pressing upon them. Servants lingered at thresholds, eyes alert to every subtle movement, every twitch, every hesitant step. Outside, the fog seemed to amplify the quiet fear, carrying the faintest sounds across the streets, echoing the patient persistence of the disease itself. In these quiet neighborhoods, the comfort of delay was a double-edged shield. It permitted life to continue with a semblance of normalcy, yet it allowed hydrophobia to establish itself with merciless precision. London's polite veneer, its reliance on observation and propriety, could not forestall what had already begun. The patient menace had threaded itself through the city, and every household, every alley, and every street now teetered on the edge of revelation. In the quiet of his study, the physician of a bustling London borough felt the weight of unease settle more firmly upon his shoulders. The ledger, once a tool of clinical detachment, had become a silent witness to the inexorable spread of a disease he could neither fully comprehend nor arrest. Each entry a child scratched, a fever rising, a sudden aversion to water was a testament to the merciless patience of hydrophobia, and with every line, the calm certainty he presented to families and society thinned, revealing the private tremor of alarm beneath. The early weeks, when minor symptoms had been attributed to fatigue or trifling colds, now seemed like lost opportunity. The disease had advanced in silence, exploiting the comfort of delay that society, in its politeness and trust, relied upon so implicitly. Families, reassured by his presence and the authority of his words, continued daily routines with only subtle caution. Mothers whispered softly over their children, servants observed vigilantly, and households maintained order with an air of polite composure. Yet even in the midst of apparent normality, the invisible menace progressed, patient and methodical, indifferent to domestic routines or professional reassurances. Each morning brought new reports, carried by footmen or letters from neighboring districts. Symptoms that had seemed minor a week before now displayed a cruel persistence: trembling hands, fevered nights, and agitation that no tonic could soothe. Children who had been scratched by dogs that seemed harmless during daily promenades now exhibited the unmistakable signs of hydrophobia, and families brought them into his study with anxious trust. He administered remedies, tonics, laudanum, poultices with meticulous care, recording every observation with antiseptic precision. Still, the patient advance of the disease left him with the uneasy realization that intervention could only address superficial discomfort. It could not touch the invisible progression already set in motion. The physician began to see patterns emerge, subtle yet undeniable. The disease moved silently, exploiting every delay in recognition, every dismissal of early signs, and every ordinary interaction with pets and children. Dogs in alleys and parks, once considered innocuous companions, were now conduits of a quiet but deadly sentence. The city's reliance on propriety, order, and authority offered little defense against an affliction that moved as patiently as the fog itself, threading invisibly through households, nurseries, and courtyards. By evening, the gas lamps flickered against fogged windows as the physician reviewed his growing ledger. Each entry, precise and clinical, was a marker of inevitability, a quiet testament to the failure of comfort, observation, and routine to halt what was unfolding. Families would continue to trust in his authority, and the city would carry on with its polite routines. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, Fear had begun to take root. He understood, in a way he could not speak aloud, that London's streets, homes, and households were now living in the patient shadow of a disease that no authority could truly contain. The physician leaned back, quill in hand, aware that the city's confidence was fragile, and that every day of delay permitted the disease to consolidate its quiet dominion. Hydrophobia, invisible and inexorable, had claimed its place within the heart of London, and the man sworn to heal now faced the weight of inevitability with a private alarm that no ledger or polite reassurance could disguise. In households across London, the early manifestations of hydrophobia were often met with a mixture of misunderstanding and misplaced confidence. Minor bites and scratches, delivered by dogs that seemed ordinary in their companionship, were dismissed as trifles, and families clung to the belief that routine care, tonics, and the authority of a physician could prevent the most dire outcomes. The early symptoms, slight tremors, agitation, feverish restlessness, and the first avoidance of water, were treated with remedies that soothed appearances but failed to touch the invisible menace within. In this reliance upon propriety and tradition, the city unwittingly allowed the disease to gain ground, exploiting the false comfort that routine offered. Mothers, guided by both fear and etiquette, administered soothing tonics and watched with anxious vigilance as children sipped milk or broths, hoping the remedy would suffice. Servants moved with careful observation, noting subtle tremors or reluctance, whispering their concerns behind closed doors. Yet even as attention was paid, the actions taken were often misdirected, addressing only the superficial expressions of illness rather than the underlying cause. The patient, invisible progress of hydrophobia continued, impervious to the rituals of care that had long governed domestic life. Physicians, too, were complicit in the misplaced confidence that allowed the disease to advance. Their authority, unquestioned and respected, encouraged families to trust that any minor bite or scratch could be managed with standard remedies. Tonics, poultices, and carefully measured doses of laudanum were administered, intended to quiet the child, ease agitation, and restore the sense of ordinary health. Yet the disease did not respond to these measures, moving quietly beneath the surface, while those above stairs clung to the comfort of perceived control. Each misapplied intervention, each reassured parent, strengthened the illusion that the city had mastery over what it could not see. Outside, London's streets continued their rhythms, indifferent to the quiet despair taking root in the parlours and nurseries. Dogs trotted along cobblestones, wagging tails, sniffing curbs, carrying within their teeth the patient verdict that would unfold with merciless inevitability. Markets bustled, tradesmen hawked wares, and the city maintained its appearance of ordinary life, even as families and physicians alike misread the subtle signs of advancing illness. The false confidence of routine, propriety, and authority masked the steady encroachment of a disease that no human vigilance could truly halt. By nightfall, the weight of misperception pressed upon households. Mothers whispered anxiously over sleeping children, servants lingered in corridors, and physicians noted cases in antiseptic journals, all convinced that intervention might yet forestall the worst. Yet the patient and invisible menace of hydrophobia moved steadily forward, exploiting the very comfort and misplaced confidence that society relied upon to maintain calm. London slept under gaslight and fog, oblivious to the quiet, inexorable spread of a disease that would soon render every household, street, and nursery vulnerable, and expose the limits of human certainty. The disease moved with a quiet deliberation that seemed almost conspiratorial, threading its way through the city while London carried on with its customary routines. Streets echoed with the distant clatter of carts and the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves. Markets bustled with merchants hawking wares, and children ran between alleys and squares, oblivious to the invisible hazard among them. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, hydrophobia advanced, patient and unrelenting, carried silently through the bite of a dog, the scratch of a playful nuzzle, and the faintest contact, that no observer could deem consequential. Its spread was unseen but certain, a creeping tide that no propriety, no domestic ritual, and no reliance on authority could fully arrest. Families, still clinging to the fragile illusion of safety, maintained routines with meticulous care. Mothers prepared tea, tucked children beneath blankets, and offered gentle reassurances, while servants observed every twitch and hesitation, cataloguing subtle deviations with a quiet vigilance born of necessity. Yet the comfort of routine, once a source of security, had become a conduit for the patient advance of disease. A child might recoil from water one moment and appear ordinary the next. A slight shiver or restless night could be dismissed as fatigue. Such moments, unremarkable in isolation, were in fact the threads through which the invisible menace extended its reach across the city. Physicians, receiving a growing volume of reports, began to notice the broader patterns. Cases were no longer isolated, but appearing in clusters across neighborhoods. Ledgers filled with entries describing restlessness, fever, subtle convulsions, and aversion to liquids. Remedies were administered: tonics, laudanum, poultices, but these treatments addressed only superficial agitation, leaving the underlying disease untouched. The patient, imperceptible progress of hydrophobia continued, regardless of human diligence, indifferent to observation or intervention. In homes, families were reassured, yet the disease, silent and precise, was already consolidating its hold. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against windows and curling along streets and alleys, obscuring dogs as they wandered and passed between households. Their movements were casual, playful, entirely ordinary to the untrained eye, yet each encounter was a potential conduit for infection. The city, confident in its routines and authority, could not perceive the scope of what moved among them. Streets were full of teeth, alleys echoed with quiet menace, and the disease's progress was meticulous, patient, and relentless. By nightfall, London felt the subtle pressure of a presence it could not see. Families whispered across bedrooms, servants lingered in dim corridors, and the physicians' ledgers grew dense with observation. Hydrophobia had become a silent architect of dread, spreading unnoticed from home to home, alley to alley, and family to family. In the hush of gaslight and fog, the city remained outwardly composed, yet beneath the veneer of civility, every street, every park, every household had become a conduit for a patient, merciless, and entirely invisible menace. In the dimly lit chambers of London's infirmaries and private homes, the work of post-mortem examination began to uncover truths that had been invisible during life. Corpses, carefully laid upon tables and prepared with antiseptic precision, revealed the quiet havoc that hydrophobia had wrought. Physicians, once confident in their ability to chart and treat illness, now confronted evidence of a disease that moved with a patience and subtlety beyond their authority. Every contorted limb, every trembling hand preserved in rigor, every disordered expression frozen in death, whispered of the invisible menace that had claimed dominion, indifferent to routine, propriety, or medical oversight. The post-mortem revealed the cruel efficiency of hydrophobia. Though outwardly mild at first, bites and scratches left little trace of the devastation they would later produce. Nerves, blood vessels, and tissues bore signs of inflammation and subtle disruption. Yet it was the mind's final betrayal, the convulsions, the delirium, the irrational fear of water that marked the disease's merciless logic. Physicians documented these findings with antiseptic exactness, recording fevered tissues, trembling musculature, and the subtle patterns of deterioration that had been invisible in life. The ledgers grew thick, each page a testament to certainty in a city clinging to appearances, while the invisible threat had already begun to shape the course of countless households. Families, initially comforted by the authority of the medical men, now received word of these revelations with quiet horror. Mothers wept in private chambers, Servants exchanged glances heavy with dread, and neighbors murmured their fears across hedges and fences. The certainty promised by tonics and laudanum, by careful observation and diligent care, proved a fragile shield against a disease whose reach was patient, precise, and implacable. Even the wealthiest households, fortified by walls, propriety, and social order, were powerless against the quiet inevitability revealed in these post-mortem accounts. In the streets, the fog pressed against windows and doors with an almost sentient persistence. Dogs, oblivious to the devastation they carried, moved through alleys and courtyards, their ordinary motions masking the invisible sentence they bore. Londoners continued their routines with the polite composure for which they were famed, yet in the shadows of their own homes, the post-mortem findings cast a long and chilling influence. The child who had seemed restless, the servant who had shivered unnoticed, the mother who had doubted her own perception, all now stood within the spectral reach of a disease that had moved unseen until death made its logic apparent. By nightfall, physicians closed their journals with a weight heavier than routine observation could bear. The findings, precise and antiseptic though they were, spoke of a city already claimed in part by hydrophobia, where every minor contact, every playful nip, every scratch, every moment of misplaced trust could carry the inexorable sentence of death. London, still confident in its routines and propriety, could not yet fully reckon with the certainty that now lay plainly before the eyes of its medical men. The patient menace was relentless, invisible, and merciless, and its post-mortem revelations were only the beginning of understanding the terror it had wrought. As the post-mortem revelations circulated through London, a slow tremor of awareness rippled across society. News traveled not only by the physicians' ledgers and letters from the provinces, but also by whispered conversations in parlors, the cautious murmurs of servants, and the polite inquiries exchanged in the city's bustling streets. Families, once confident in the routine and propriety of their lives, began to sense that the invisible menace threading through the city was no longer abstract, no longer distant. Hydrophobia, patient, invisible, and inexorably advancing, had become a matter of public consciousness, forcing the elite and the ordinary alike to confront a terror that defied comprehension. The city's upper echelons convened in private, within the dimly lit halls of gentlemen's clubs and spacious townhouses, debating measures both practical and symbolic. Gas lamps flickered over long tables of polished mahogany. Men in frock coats and high collars consulted one another with measured tones, discussing the necessity of quarantines, restrictions on animals, and careful surveillance of children. The conversation was polite, precise, yet carried beneath it a keen anxiety. The comfort of normalcy, the veneer of civility, could no longer conceal the patient threat pressing against the city's edges. Letters from provincial towns, reporting clusters of restless children and sudden fatalities, reinforced the awareness that the disease was spreading with relentless consistency, indifferent to social rank or propriety. In households across the city, mothers and governesses adjusted routines with careful attention, guided by both fear and social expectation. Windows were shuttered more tightly, children kept close, and pets watched with suspicion. Servants moved silently through hallways, alert to every twitch, every hesitation, every faint indication of agitation. Tonics and laudanum were administered with increased diligence, yet it was clear that remedies could do little to halt what had already been set in motion. Hydrophobia moved patiently, quietly, its progression invisible to the untrained eye, and every attempt at control seemed a temporary reprieve rather than a true safeguard. Clergy, too, were drawn into the conversation, their voices carrying reassurances while urging vigilance and caution. Sermons emphasized the necessity of care, the responsibilities of guardianship, and the moral imperative to protect the young. Polite society, bound by etiquette and propriety, responded as it knew best, through observation, caution, and ritualized concern. Yet beneath these measures lay an unspoken acknowledgement. The invisible teeth of the disease could not be fully anticipated, and even the most careful vigilance offered only partial shelter. By evening, London itself seemed to pulse with anxious energy. Fog pressed thickly against the gas lamps, curling through alleys and across streets, amplifying the sense of menace. Families whispered over candles, servants exchanged guarded observations, and physicians' ledgers filled with meticulous detail. The city, in its collective awareness, had begun to respond not with panic, but with cautious measures born of necessity. Yet hydrophobia, patient and merciless, continued its advance, moving silently through homes, streets, and hearts alike. A quiet reminder that society's measures, however precise, could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. As London's awareness of the invisible menace grew, the city began to take measures designed to protect what it could, even as the disease continued its patient advance. Families, servants, and physicians alike adopted precautions, small yet meticulous, intended to shield children from the subtle danger carried by ordinary pets and the slightest inadvertent contact. Windows were shuttered against the pervasive fog, doors kept tightly closed, and dogs were observed with an almost obsessive vigilance. Mothers insisted on supervision in every domestic corner, their hands resting lightly on trembling children, ready to intervene at the first sign of agitation or fear. In households of wealth and influence, preventive measures became ritualized. Children were forbidden to play beyond the immediate confines of gardens and courtyards. Servants were instructed to monitor interactions closely, and even the placement of food and drink was carefully controlled. Tonics, laudanum, and poultices were applied not merely to treat symptoms, but as prophylaxis, a way of maintaining the fragile semblance of safety in a world increasingly revealed to be uncertain. Physicians visited regularly, examining children for the faintest tremors, noting every reluctance to drink, every flicker of unease. Their authority, absolute in public, was now pressed into the service of cautious anticipation, as the invisible progression of hydrophobia defied all confidence in ordinary observation. Beyond the private homes, the city itself began to implement measures designed to mitigate exposure. Markets and public spaces were regulated with careful attention. Stray dogs were rounded up or muzzled, their movements restricted to prevent contact with children or unwary adults. Notices were posted, warnings circulated, and families encouraged to maintain vigilance. Even the fog, thick and patient, seemed to be treated as a silent accomplice in this new awareness, the city pressing its inhabitants to observe carefully, to act with caution, and to recognize that the ordinary could conceal mortal danger. Servants, trained in observation and diligence, became the linchpins of these preventive measures. They monitored children's interactions with animals, noted subtle changes in behavior, and whispered their observations to mothers and physicians alike. Their vigilance extended to every corner of the household, from kitchens to nurseries, hallways to staircases. Each twitch, each moment of hesitation, was recorded mentally, a marker of the disease's invisible reach. While remedies could not halt the underlying menace, these careful observations allowed families to respond swiftly when symptoms began to manifest. By nightfall, the streets were quieter, the gas lamps flickering against the fog as families retreated behind closed doors. Children were tucked into beds, pets confined to corners of the home, and the servants' quiet watch persisted, eyes attuned to the slightest sign of trouble. Physicians' ledgers grew ever fuller with precise notes, each entry a record of observation, precaution, and patient vigilance. London had begun to act, not with panic, but with careful deliberation. Yet hydrophobia, patient and inexorable, continued to advance unseen, threading through the city's households, streets, and alleys, a quiet and merciless reminder that even the most meticulous preventive measures could only delay, never fully prevent, the inevitable. Even as London's streets and households adopted precautions, windows shuttered, Children observed, dogs muzzled or confined. The shadow of hydrophobia lingered, stretching across the city like a slow-moving fog that no gas lamp could fully dispel. The disease, patient and invisible, had already threaded itself through homes, nurseries, and alleys, establishing dominion in places where the city had believed itself safe. Politeness and propriety, once the pillars of daily life, now offered only a fragile illusion of protection. Every household, no matter how well ordered, carried within it the quiet weight of anticipation, a knowledge unspoken but universally understood. The menace had arrived, and its patient persistence could not be ignored. Mothers continued their vigilance, whispering softly to children who slept fitfully under heavy quilts. Servants lingered in corridors and doorways, attentive to every subtle twitch, every fevered sigh, every reluctant sip of water. Physicians, called to examine the restless and the fevered, recorded symptoms in antiseptic detail. Yet even their authority could not fully contend with the disease's inexorable reach. Tonics, poultices, and measured doses of laudanum soothed only the surface manifestations of agitation, leaving the invisible progression untouched. The city's confidence, grounded in routine and observation, faltered under the weight of this quiet certainty. Hydrophobia moved silently, patiently, and without mercy. In the fog-laden streets, dogs trotted with ordinary purpose, noses sniffing along curbstones, tails wagging, carrying within them the unseen threat. Market stalls, public squares, and courtyards appeared unchanged in the day's bustle. Yet the patient spread of disease had already established its hold in countless households. Children brushed against animals, servants delivered meals, and families went about the rhythms of daily life, unaware that each ordinary contact might carry the first step of an inevitable sentence. London's ordinary bustle had become the conduit for the patient terror, lurking beneath the city's veneer of civility. Even in homes fortified by wealth and propriety, the disease's presence was unmistakable. Fevered hands trembled beneath lace cuffs, reluctant mouths refused water, and small faces twisted in the beginnings of irrational fear. Servants recorded each deviation quietly, noting patterns in preparation for the inevitable consultations with physicians. Letters from provincial towns reinforced the knowledge that London was not unique in its vulnerability. The disease moved steadily across counties, patient and unyielding, invisible to all but the most careful observers. By evening, the city seemed to hold its breath beneath the gaslight and the thickening fog. Families gathered in parlors and bedrooms, whispering reassurances while listening intently for the faintest indications of agitation. Servants moved quietly, alert to the smallest twitch or hesitation. Physicians' ledgers grew ever heavier with meticulous observations, a testament to both diligence and helplessness. The city's comfort, so long reliant on routine, propriety, and authority, was now overshadowed by patient dread. The disease, imperceptible and merciless, had already begun to shape the rhythm of London life, a lingering shadow that promised the inevitability of fear, delirium, and death. The first outbreak of hydrophobia had passed, or so the city believed, but London remained suspended in a tension that no gas lamp could fully illuminate. Streets, once teeming with the ordinary rhythms of commerce and play, now carried an undercurrent of apprehension. Families moved with cautious deliberation, eyes darting toward passing animals. Children kept close to the side of their guardians, servants lingering in corridors and doorways with the watchful attention of those who had glimpsed the disease's merciless progress. Though the immediate crisis seemed to have abated, the memory of deaths, the subtle tremors, and the inexplicable fear that had afflicted children lingered in every household like a shadow that could not be brushed away. Mothers continued their vigilance with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Even after a day of calm, a quiet sigh or a restless stir in bed was enough to awaken suspicion. Servants observed with meticulous care, noting every minor deviation in behavior, every flicker of agitation. every hesitant sip of water. It was as if the household itself had learned to breathe carefully, attuned to the faintest signs that might signal the disease's return. Even when children appeared well, the lessons of the outbreak remained alive in the minds of those who had tended them through fever and delirium, shaping every interaction, every glance, every gesture. Physicians, too, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon them. Their ledgers, filled with the precise recording of cases, symptoms, and remedies, now served as a reminder that what had been invisible and subtle could suddenly erupt with devastating clarity. The first outbreak had revealed both the limits of observation and the fragility of authority. Tonics and laudanum had soothed agitation, but they had not arrested the disease. Each careful entry in the ledger bore witness to the silent, patient progression of hydrophobia, a force indifferent to propriety, to vigilance, or to the confidence of even the most learned men in white coats. Outside, the fog pressed through streets and alleys with its usual persistence, curling around lampposts, walls, and fences, muting the ordinary sounds of life while amplifying the city's quiet apprehension. Dogs moved as they always had, yet their ordinary motions now carried a weight previously unrecognized. Every scratch, every playful nip, every contact between child and animal became a potential vector, a reminder that the disease's patient reach extended far beyond the immediate household. Even after an outbreak, London's streets were no longer ordinary. They were conduits of unseen peril, each encounter fraught with uncertainty and silent dread. By evening, families remained alert, drawing curtains and shuttering windows, maintaining routines that now carried an unspoken vigilance. Servants lingered, attentive to every twitch, every sigh, every hesitation, while physicians reviewed their notes, reflecting on the cruel lessons of the past weeks. The outbreak had passed, yet the fear it seeded remained, a quiet and persistent presence shaping behavior, altering perception, and reminding all that London, no matter how confident in its propriety and authority, could never fully escape the patient, merciless advance of hydrophobia. The disease had entered the city, leaving behind not only the memory of death, but a lingering shadow over every home, every street, and every heart. Even after the immediate threat of the outbreak had subsided, London's households remained ensnared in a tension that was quiet but pervasive. Families whispered among themselves in parlors dimly lit by gas lamps, the soft flicker of flame casting shadows that seemed to stretch across walls and ceilings like elongated fingers. Mothers spoke cautiously of children's behavior, noting the smallest tremor of a hand, the faint hesitation at a cup of water, or a restless toss beneath the blankets. Words were carefully chosen, measured, and polite, yet beneath them lay the unmistakable pulse of fear, a quiet recognition that hydrophobia had touched their lives and that its patient menace could return at any moment. Servants, attuned to the subtle rhythms of the household, became both observers and messengers of caution. They moved silently through corridors and stairwells, their ears alert to sighs and muttered phrases, their eyes following the restless gestures of children and pets alike. Every twitch, every glance, every subtle refusal to drink water was noted, catalogued, and relayed, not in alarm but in careful, deliberate observation. These whispers and watchings, invisible to those outside the home, formed the first line of vigilance, a quiet attempt to forestall the disease's inexorable advance, though none could pretend that it was wholly preventable. In parlors and nurseries, the act of whispering itself became a ritual, a cautious acknowledgement of fear that could not be spoken aloud too loudly lest it spread panic. Mothers huddled close to one another, discussing rumors from the provinces, tales of minor bites escalating to fever and delirium, and the first fatalities that had revealed the disease's merciless efficiency. The conversations were punctuated by furtive glances toward children and pets, each sigh a silent reminder that even the most ordinary moments feeding, dressing, or tending to a child could carry the risk of exposure. Londoners, though outwardly composed, were becoming attuned to the subtle signs of danger, understanding in fragments and whispers what had previously been concealed. Physicians, consulted by multiple households, reinforced the cautious tone. Remedies were prescribed with precision, observation encouraged, and strict care emphasized. Yet they were careful not to overstate the danger. The patient spread of the disease had taught them humility. Authority, though respected, could not change the inexorable progression of hydrophobia. Families clung to the advice of learned men, balancing vigilance with the comfort of domestic routine. Yet whispers continued to thread through the quiet rooms, a subtle reminder that the city was not as safe as it appeared. Even outside the homes, the fog pressed in along cobblestones and lamplit streets, curling around corners and alleys, concealing ordinary motion while hinting at the unseen. Dogs, once companions, now carried the invisible menace through streets and courtyards alike, while Londoners, guided by whispered advice and shared vigilance, moved with a heightened attentiveness. Each quiet warning, each hushed observation within households, served as a fragile bulwark against the merciless patience of hydrophobia, a disease that respected neither wealth, propriety, nor the careful routines of even the most attentive families. By nightfall, the city had grown quieter still, each household cloaked in the hushed language of precaution. The whispers, the watchings, and the patient vigilance became the rhythm of life, as families, servants, and children alike navigated a world forever altered by an invisible threat. Hydrophobia, though unseen, had claimed its dominion over perception and practice, leaving London bound in the quiet gravity of caution, anticipation, and whispered fear. By the time the second month of the outbreak had passed, the city's servants had become the silent custodians of vigilance, moving through households with a careful deliberation born of necessity. In every parlor, nursery, and kitchen, they observed what others might dismiss: a twitch of a hand, a fleeting glance at a cup of water, the restless shifting of a child beneath blankets. Their movements were quiet, measured, almost imperceptible, yet in these subtle attentions lay a profound understanding of the invisible menace that had crept through London's streets and penetrated its homes. Every step, every tilt of the head, every soft footfall carried with it the weight of anticipation, a careful watch against a patient and unyielding disease. The children, unaware of the true danger, continued their games and routines within the confines of well-observed rooms. A small hand might reach for a toy, a foot shuffle along a rug, a head turn toward a pet all ordinary, all innocent, yet each interaction could carry the quiet sentence of hydrophobia. Mothers, attentive yet reliant on the guidance of both servants and physicians, watched with careful composure, adjusting quilts and soothing restless breaths. The servants' silent vigilance had become essential, their quiet presence a line of defense that the city itself could not provide. Even in households of considerable wealth, where gates, fences, and propriety offered the illusion of safety, the patient advance of disease respected neither status nor circumstance. In kitchens and corridors, servants moved with a rhythm attuned to the household's fragile equilibrium. They adjusted the placement of dishes, ensured that water was offered carefully, and monitored interactions between children and pets with an almost ritualistic precision. Conversations were whispered, observations passed along discreetly, and every slight anomaly in behavior catalogued mentally for future reference. Even as tonics, laudanum, and poultices were administered to alleviate agitation, it was the quiet watchfulness of these attendants that allowed families to navigate the delicate period between invisible exposure and the onset of unmistakable symptoms. Outside, London's streets carried the familiar cadence of life, yet the fog pressed thick against windows and over cobblestones, muting the sounds of carts, horses, and distant voices. Dogs, trotting casually through the mist, carried within them the patient and invisible danger. Their ordinary motions belied the severity of their presence. The city remained outwardly confident, its routines largely intact, yet within the households themselves, servants had become the true observers of what the human eye could not perceive. Every twitch, every sigh, every hesitation was recorded mentally, a testament to the quiet understanding that had developed from necessity and experience. By nightfall, the gas lamps flickered against the fog, casting long shadows across the polished floors of townhouses. Children slept fitfully beneath blankets, mothers lingered in quiet observation, and servants moved through corridors with careful attentiveness, listening, watching, and noting the slightest deviations. Their patient vigilance had become the rhythm of domestic life, a quiet counterpoint to the invisible, inexorable advance of hydrophobia. In their silence, London's households learned to respect the merciless patience of a disease that spared no innocence and no attention. In its silent, merciless passage through the city, in the quiet chambers of London's physicians, the ledgers began to grow with a rapidity that alarmed even the most stoic of men in white coats. Each page, lined with precise columns and antiseptic ink, recorded cases that had once seemed trivial: a scratch, a minor bite, a restless night. Now these small notations bore a weight that could not be ignored. Fevered hands, trembling limbs, and subtle aversions to water were chronicled with meticulous care. Yet the physicians knew, in the private recesses of their minds, that the disease was advancing beyond the confines of observation, patient and merciless. The ledgers became monuments to both diligence and helplessness. Families arrived daily with children who had been scratched by dogs that seemed ordinary, or who displayed the faintest signs of agitation or fever. Mothers whispered anxiously, servants observed silently, and physicians recorded symptoms with antiseptic detachment, offering remedies that addressed only the superficial manifestations of distress. Tonics, laudanum, and poultices provided temporary relief, but the invisible progression of hydrophobia continued unabated, threading through households and neighborhoods with patient inevitability. The growing ledgers were a reminder that observation alone could not forestall the disease. It merely documented the silent, relentless advance of terror. Physicians reviewed their ledgers in the quiet hours, noting subtle patterns emerging across districts: clusters of restless children, households reporting minor bites, and the first unmistakable signs of hydrophobia manifesting in previously unaffected areas. Each entry, though written with clinical precision, carried an unspoken weight. It was a chronicle not merely of symptoms but of inevitability, a record of a disease that was patient, invisible, and indifferent to propriety or the authority of those sworn to heal. The ledgers themselves seemed to thicken with foreboding, a tactile representation of the city's growing awareness that hydrophobia was no longer confined to rumor or isolated households. Meanwhile, the city moved with its familiar rhythm. Streets were still traversed by horse and cart, markets bustled with merchants, and children ran along alleys with laughter that belied the silent threat threading its way between homes. Dogs, oblivious to the chaos they carried in their teeth, trotted freely, nuzzling children and brushing past adults. Londoners remained largely unaware of the disease's full scope, yet the physicians' ledgers, filling with methodical entries, held the truth in stark relief. The invisible menace had already begun to dominate the city's households and routines. By night, gas lamps flickered against fog-laden streets while the physicians, alone in their studies, reflected on the growing weight of documentation. Each careful observation, each meticulous note, was a testament to both vigilance and impotence. The disease had infiltrated the city, threading its patient way through children, households, and streets, and the ledgers growing, ever more filled, stood as a silent witness to the inexorable advance of hydrophobia, a patient, merciless force that no amount of care or authority could fully resist. As the physicians' ledgers grew heavy with meticulous records, The subtle unease that had threaded through London's households began to seep into the public consciousness. Whispers in parlours became topics of cautious conversation in markets, and servants, moving between homes, carried fragments of information like delicate, whispered cargo. Rumours spread quietly, at first an unusual restlessness here, a fevered child there, but the accumulation of small observations began to exert a weight upon the city. Londoners, ever polite and careful in their speech, found themselves confronting a fear that could no longer be entirely concealed behind routines or propriety. The city's authorities and medical men moved swiftly, albeit quietly, to address the growing concern. Notices were posted at the entrances to markets, reminding citizens to supervise children and to observe dogs with caution. Public animal control efforts increased. Strays were rounded up, dogs were muzzled, and households were advised to restrict contact between children and pets. The measures were designed not to incite panic, for public alarm was feared almost as much as the disease itself, but to instill a careful vigilance that might slow, if not prevent, further transmission. Even the fog that wrapped itself around the city's streets seemed, in the collective imagination, to conspire with these efforts, concealing dangers while amplifying anxiety. Mothers carried these advisories home, whispering them to children, who did not fully comprehend the threat but absorbed the tension nonetheless. Servants, already vigilant within households, now doubled their watchfulness, observing interactions, monitoring behavior, and noting the smallest deviations for the physician's inspection. The ordinary rhythms of life, play, meals, walks, were now conducted under the pressure of caution, each step measured, each movement considered. Families adapted, creating a fragile lattice of attention that could provide only partial protection against a menace as patient and invisible as hydrophobia. Physicians advised these preventive measures with careful authority. They cautioned families about stray dogs, recommended observation of minor scratches, and insisted upon careful documentation of early symptoms. Tonics and laudanum continued to soothe agitation, but the medical men understood privately that these remedies addressed only appearances. The disease, relentless and unseen, had already threaded its way into the fabric of households, moving with patience that no authority or propriety could fully counter. Evening descended upon the city with its usual fog and gaslight, casting long, trembling shadows along streets and alleys. Families huddled indoors, whispering guidance to one another. Servants lingered in hallways, attentive to the slightest twitch or sigh. Physicians reviewed their ledgers, the entries growing more numerous with each passing day. Public measures and household vigilance combined to slow the disease's immediate progress, yet they could not forestall its patient advance. London, polite and orderly, confronted a reality that no routine could fully shield it from. The invisible menace moved through streets, homes, and nurseries with quiet inevitability. Public alarm, carefully managed, and the city's measured interventions could only delay the inevitable. The patient, merciless progression of hydrophobia continued, threading through every household, every alley, and every street, a quiet, inescapable shadow that London could neither see nor fully resist. In the gaslit corridors of London's townhouses, in the narrow alleys lined with damp brick, and in the fog-bound streets where children had once played freely, the disease now cast its most insidious presence, the invisible verdict. It was a sentence neither declared aloud nor delivered with ceremony, yet its authority was absolute. A scratch, a playful nip, the brief contact of a child's hand with a dog that had seemed harmless. These ordinary incidents were now understood, in retrospect, as the first whispers of judgment. London, confident in its propriety, its domestic routines, and its reliance on medical authority, had been blind to the quiet, merciless logic of the disease. Mothers, now fully alert to the subtle threats, watched children with unrelenting vigilance. The quiet tremor of a hand, a sudden shiver, a hesitant sip of water, Each small sign was interpreted through the lens of experience and fear. The servants, ever patient observers, moved through corridors and stairwells like shadows, attentive to every nuance, every deviation from normal behavior. They documented in silence, relaying their observations to physicians with careful discretion. Each note, each whispered concern, served as a record of the disease's invisible reach, an acknowledgement that the comfort of routine could no longer shield the innocent. Physicians, reviewing their expanding ledgers, noted the consistency and predictability of the disease's progression. Early agitation, fever, restlessness, aversion to water, and subtle convulsions all conspired to reveal the patient mechanism of hydrophobia. Remedies, tonics, laudanum, poultices offered fleeting relief, yet they addressed only the surface agitation, leaving the underlying affliction unchallenged. The invisible verdict of the disease, however, was inevitable. Its patient advance, unnoticed in its earlier stages, was now impossible to deny, and the city's confidence in authority and propriety began to fracture under the weight of undeniable mortality. Outside, fog pressed thickly against windows, curling through streets and across alleys, muffling the ordinary sounds of life while amplifying the tension of anticipation. Dogs, unaware of the consequences they carried, continued their casual movements, tails wagging, noses sniffing at cobblestones. Londoners, focused on propriety and routine, failed to perceive that each encounter, every brush of fur, every minor bite, every interaction, thought harmless, carried the quiet certainty of the disease's sentence. The invisible verdict, patient and precise, had already begun to manifest in the tremors, fevers, and irrational fears of those it had claimed. By nightfall, every household, from the grandest townhouse to the humblest dwelling, felt the weight of this unseen authority. Gas lamps flickered against the mist, shadows stretching along polished floors and narrow corridors. Families whispered guidance to one another, servants moved with careful attention, and physicians' ledgers overflowed with meticulous entries. London, outwardly composed, was now fully aware, if only in fragments, that hydrophobia had delivered its invisible verdict, patient, merciless, and inexorable. The city's streets, homes, and hearts had been touched, and no measure of propriety, observation, or domestic vigilance could annul what had already been set in motion. By the final weeks of the outbreak, London itself seemed to carry a weight in its streets, a lingering presence that no gas lamp, shuttered window, or careful watch could entirely dispel. The city was haunted, not by specters of the imagination, but by the memory of a disease that had moved invisibly, patiently, and mercilessly through its homes, nurseries, and alleys. Families spoke in hushed tones of children who had been scratched or bitten, of servants who had observed subtle signs too late, of physicians whose ledgers had grown impossibly dense with the documentation of symptoms and fatalities. Even in the grandest townhouses, the polite veneer of civility could not hide the quiet tremor of fear that had settled beneath every routine. The fog, persistent and heavy, pressed against the city's streets like an accomplice to the disease, wrapping alleys, courtyards, and open squares in a suffocating embrace. Dogs, unaware of the havoc they had wrought, trotted through markets and parks with ordinary motions, yet every interaction they had carried the invisible verdict of hydrophobia. Children, once innocent in their play, now approached pets with hesitation. Mothers watched with anxious eyes, noting the smallest twitch, the faintest reluctance to drink, the restlessness that lingered even after nights of careful sleep. Servants moved quietly through corridors, vigilant and unceasing, recording the subtle deviations that might signal the disease's quiet advance. Physicians, their ledgers overflowing, reflected on the patient, merciless logic of the disease. Remedies, tonics, laudanum, poultices had offered temporary reprieve, but had never halted the progression of hydrophobia. The early mistakes, the delayed recognition of symptoms, and the false confidence of routine had allowed the disease to embed itself, threading unseen through households and streets alike. Every observation, every carefully recorded symptom, was a testament not to control, but to inevitability. London's citizens had learned, with a mixture of horror and reluctant comprehension, that authority, propriety, and domestic vigilance could only delay the consequences, never prevent them. In parlours and nurseries, mothers whispered to one another, recounting stories of the afflicted, cautioning children, and conveying instructions to servants with meticulous care. Even as the city attempted to return to ordinary life, the shadow of hydrophobia remained palpable. Public measures had reduced immediate contact, muzzled dogs, and regulated markets, yet the patient, invisible menace, had already taken hold. Families, servants, and physicians alike carried the memory of fear, uncertainty, and loss as a constant companion, woven into the fabric of everyday life. By nightfall, London's fog-encased streets were quiet but tense. Gas lamps flickered against the damp stones, shadows stretching across alleys and doorways. The city, though outwardly composed, bore the indelible mark of hydrophobia. The invisible menace had reshaped domestic routines, altered the behavior of children and servants, and left every household aware that the ordinary carried hidden peril. London was haunted, not by spectres of imagination, but by the patient, merciless advance of a disease that respected neither wealth, propriety, nor the authority of men in white coats. Its reach had been silent yet absolute, and the memory of its passage would linger in the city's fog, its streets, and its households for years to come.